What you are about to hear is a special presentation from the History Things Podcast. It's been 20 years since the September 11th, 2001 terror attacks in New York City, Washington, D.C., and in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. And, a lot has transpired between then and now. And as we look back on 20 years, Matt and I had a lot of thoughts, a lot of feelings, and we felt that we would just share them with each other, with you, with some of our friends and colleagues. And so this episode is dedicated to the 2,977 people killed in the terror attacks on September 11, 2001 at the World Trade Center site near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C., as well as to the more than 7,000 American servicemen and women who lost their lives in the War on Terror.
The History Things Podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Welcome to a special commemorative edition of the History Things Podcast. I'm your co-host, Pat McGuire, and joining me as always is my co-host, Matt Borders.
Hello, everyone.
Tonight, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. It's been 20 years since the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and on Flight 93. We're going to be spending some time tonight reflecting on what the past 2 decades have been like, or what our experiences were on that day, and we're going to be featuring some conversations we've had with some friends, colleagues, family members of ours, just to sort of gain their perspectives and things like that, because one of the things that Matt and I have discussed on and off over the last few years is that one of the overwhelmingly common experiences of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001 was a sort of indirect kind of third party. The best way you could describe it is the majority of us watched it on television. Not too many of us were directly connected to people in the World Trade Centers, at the Pentagon, or on Flight 93. The majority of us don't know somebody directly that died. Though it's weird, if you're in the bar scene, somehow everybody knows somebody. But we just want to be real about this, is the majority of us, and all of us, are impacted by this day, which is why 20 years later, when you say things like 9/11 or never forget, there is immediate emotion, and it's strong. So tonight, Matt and I are going to just sort of take you back to the events of September 11th, 2001, and just kind of lay out the timeline of what unfolded on one of the worst days in American history. To quote President Franklin Roosevelt, it was a day that lives in infamy, right up there with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. So tonight, we're going to start at the very beginning of the story, just by going over a simple timeline, just to kind of lay out what happened, where it happened, and sort of the times and what was going on. So we thank you all for joining us on this very special edition of the History Things Podcast. I remember that it was a Tuesday morning, and the only reason I remember that is because I know the next day is Wednesday and the day before is Monday, and I know that I can't tell you really what happened on either of those 2 days. but because of what happened on September 11th, 2001, I remember everything about this day. I remember it was a gorgeous Tuesday morning. I was 15 years old, and I was going to Thomas Wooten High School in Rockville, Maryland.
I was 20 years old at the time and attending my sophomore year at Michigan State University.
Now, before we continue with the recollection of the day itself, let's go back to the beginning of the timeline of events, just so that we can set some context for the conversation we're about to have.
At 7:59 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 with 92 people aboard, took off from Boston's Logan International Airport en route to Los Angeles. Now, 15 minutes later, at 8:14, United Airlines Flight 175, a Boeing 767 with 65 people aboard, took off from Boston. It is also headed to Los Angeles.
At roughly the same time that United Airlines Flight 175 was taking off from Boston, American Airlines Flight 11 was being hijacked. The FBI was notified within minutes. Only minutes after that, at 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Dulles International Airport just outside of Washington, D.C. The Boeing 757 was headed to Los Angeles with 64 people aboard.
At 8:40 a.m., air traffic controllers at the Federal Aviation Administration alerted the North American Aerospace Defense Command's Northeast Air Defense Sector about the suspected hijacking of Flight 11. In response, the Northeast Air Defense Sector scrambled 2 fighter jets from Cape Cod's Otis Air National Guard Base. These fighters did not reach Flight 11 prior to it crashing into the North Tower. Within moments of the FAA's alert, United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 with 44 people aboard, took off from Newark International Airport en route to San Francisco. It had been scheduled to depart at 8 a.m., around the time that the other hijacked flights took off.
At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, the first plane to be hijacked, crashed into the World Trade Center's North Tower between the floors 93 and 99, killing everybody on board instantaneously and hundreds inside the building within seconds.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers
We're
of the
getting
World Trade
reports of
Center.
a plane crash in the World Trade Center in New York. You can see the pictures there.
And you're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that.
Within moments of the first plane's crash into the North Tower of the World Trade Center complex, New York's first responders began arriving on the scene. A little bit after 9 o'clock in the morning, I was in one of my music classes, and my teacher at the time often had the television on back around his desk, sort of tilted away from the class so as not to distract us, but very regularly it had a news channel, one of the 24-hour networks.
I remember that morning, like I did most mornings in school, trying to squeeze every little bit of sleep I could out of the morning before having to go to class. I only had one class on Tuesday, and I generally did not get up until the very last moment I had to throw my clothes on brush my teeth, and run out the door.
And I remember that right as I was settling into class, I noticed that one of the World Trade Center buildings was on fire. And I started reading the headlines as he was taking roll, and they were saying that, a plane had flown into one of the towers. And, this was really early in the events unfolding, and obviously we didn't know a lot at the time, so...
But at around 8:45 that morning, as I'm hearing my roommate do his usual knocking around and things, I'd generally be hearing him watch cartoons or something. But something was different. He had the news on, and something had happened. By that point, just after 8:45, I guess it was, the first tower had been hit, so I never actually saw that.
I just kind of went, damn. And just went back to what I was supposed to do as a 15-year-old kid in one of my classes in high school, do my best to pay attention. And it wasn't until a little bit later that the day really started to change. Just minutes after that, at 9:03 a.m., the hijackers aboard United Airlines Flight 175 crashed the plane into the South Tower of the World Trade Center complex between the floors 75 and 85, killing everyone on board and hundreds inside the building.
And then the second plane comes in.
And you're watching.
And I'm watching. And I think that was a lot of people's experience, because we were all kind of figuring out what's going on. This looks bad, but this is not something that happens every day.
I think it was right after 9 o'clock in the morning. And I think, I don't know if I said it out loud or not, but I definitely went, oh,
Just saw another plane coming in from the side.
You did. I did. That was out of
Yes, and that's the second explosion. You could see the plane come in just from the right-hand side of the screen.
Do you know if there were many people in the building?
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it?
Yes.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street.
I understood in the moment that something absolutely incomprehensibly wild just happened.
Right.
And I didn't know what to do, what it meant, why it happened, what's happening next, what it meant for the why, what's, the who's, all that came flooding, and I get overwhelmed as a 35-year-old guy thinking about it. I was 15.
And I'm at my computer, my laptop there in the common room watching this, and Brandon and my roommates watching this, and I'm just letting time burn because I want to get as much information as I can, and I'm watching my email at the same time because AOL Instant Messenger is lighting up. I was big time AOL Instant Messenger at that time, is lighting up. Emails are starting to bounce around the University, Michigan State, certain professors canceling classes, things of that nature. And I'm just waiting for that email to come in for German 101. And I remember being very pissed off at just about the time class was supposed to start that I hadn't gotten that email, and I had to bolt from my dorm to get to class. But again, like I said, only one class that day, 50-minute class. I was done by 10, but it was one of the longest 50 minutes I've ever experienced because I know the TA that was teaching that class was just trying to do his job and was just trying to maybe even work through his own anxieties about what was going on the day. He was a good dude. He even tried to help me, even though I failed that class for the first time. I took it. But he had class that day. He held class that day, and a lot of other professors and TAs were canceling their courses. And I remember being really, really annoyed that I couldn't sit there and keep eating the information about what was going on. At 9:08 a.m., with the two towers having been struck, the FAA banned all takeoffs and flights going to New York City or through the city's airspace. At 9:21, the Port Authority of New York City closed all bridges and tunnels in and around New York City.
Speaking from Florida around 9:30 in the morning, President George W. Bush called the events in New York City, quote, an apparent terrorist attack on our country. This is the first time that the term terrorism is applied to the September 11, 2001 attacks.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
At 9:37 a.m., just minutes after the president's address, hijackers aboard Flight 77 crashed the plane into the western facade of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing 59 people aboard the plane and 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building.
They started talking about the Pentagon. It's like, what the hell is going on here?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. We're looking at a live picture from Washington, and there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon. It would appear that there has been another major explosion, this one in the nation's capital. You are looking at a scene of apparent blast aftermath.
There is a lot of confusion here at the Pentagon. It appears that something hit the Pentagon on the outside of the 5th corridor, on the Army corridor. Several Army officers I talked to reported hearing a big explosion, seeing shards of metal coming past their window. The Pentagon has been evacuated. Emergency services personnel were rushing to reports of several people trapped in the building. Most of the building's 24,000 people are outside of the building or in the center courtyard.
For the first time in United States history, the FAA grounded all flights over or bound for the continental United States. Over the next 2.5 hours, 3,300 commercial flights and 1,200 private planes are guided to land at airports in Canada and throughout the United States. By 9:45, amid escalating rumors of other attacks, the White House and U.S. Capitol building are evacuated, along with other high-profile buildings and landmarks throughout the country.
A lot of the parents of the kids I was going to school with were federal employees. They worked at various places, Department of Justice, things like that. A lot of them worked at the State Department, and that was one of the ones that really started to create a buzz in my high school was the rumored bomb that either went off or was about to go off right outside the State Department. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center, the second building to be struck, collapses.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
That is extraordinary. The South Tower, the World Trade Center, has collapsed.
I remember the reports coming in about 93 and the first images of the smoking fields.
10:07 a.m. After passengers and crew members aboard the hijacked Flight 93 contact family and friends and learn about the attacks in Washington, D.C. and New York City, they mount an attempt to retake the plane. In response to this, the hijackers deliberately crashed the plane into a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, killing all 40 passengers and crew aboard.
As we're saying there near Shanksville, a small town in Somerset County, about 80 miles south of Pittsburgh. This the site of one of the 2 United Airlines aircraft. This a Boeing 757 left Newark, New Jersey this morning on its way to San Francisco. This is the plane that we know crashed, and you just, with David Mattingly's report, looking at the site of where this plane came down. We don't know where, we presume terrorists behind this, what their destination was, what their target was. We can only presume, we can only guess that they were short of the target, that they were headed someplace farther, someplace else from where they landed.
Just shy of half an hour after the South Tower had collapsed in New York City, at 10:28 a.m., the World Trade Center's North Tower collapses, 102 minutes after being struck by Flight 11.
We're taking live pictures from our colleagues at Fox News in New York. We know that one of the twin towers at the World Trade Center in New York collapsed a short time ago. Some 25,000 people work inside that building. You just saw live here on Sky News. The second tower has collapsed.
At 11 a.m., New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani called for the evacuation of Lower Manhattan south of Canal Street. This included over 1 million residents, workers, and tourists. As the evacuation was occurring, efforts continued to look for survivors at the World Trade Center site.
By 3 o'clock in the afternoon on September 11, 2001, the United States military had been placed on high alert worldwide. The U.S. Navy had dispatched missile destroyers to New York and Washington, D.C. By 5:20 p.m., the 47-story 7 World Trade Center building collapses after burning for hours. The building had been evacuated in the morning, and there were no casualties reported, though the collapse did force rescue workers to flee for their lives. It is the last of the World Trade Center complex buildings to fall.
President George W. Bush returned to the White House after making stops at military bases in both Louisiana and Nebraska. By 8:30, President Bush addressed the nation.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
The war on terror as we know it had begun.
The following conversation contains audio samples from several friends, colleagues, and family members. The opinions expressed are their own. You know, there's an announcement that's made within like 5 minutes of the second plane being hit. They come over the PA system and they make an announcement that like there's been an attack, which I thought was interesting, even in real time in 2001, that like we were very clear that by the time the second plane happened, that this was not an accident. Which to me, even looking back on it now, I'm like, how could we connect the dots that fast? This could just be the most insane thing that's occurring. Like there was no context for planes being hijacked and turned into like literal missiles. That's never happened before like this. Like we've never...
Not to this scale.
Sure.
I mean, we have the kamikazes of World War II and those in Germany late in the war, but nothing at this scale. Nothing in the immediate modern era.
And that's a whole different concept, right? We're talking about we're talking about
war like, desperation.
And these like, especially with like the Japanese, like the way that their culture views honor and things like that, like, you know, using yourself, and it's similar, but I think it was really different. And I think as far as from a civilian sense, like we weren't expecting that on the home front. Like,
right.
Again, when you're talking kamikazes, you're talking, you know, Japanese Zeros crashing inside a battleship,
right,
which is a battle. And like same thing with the Luftwaffe later in the war when they're getting desperate. But like you're not expecting a Boeing to just like come crashing into the, you know, the hub of commerce for most of the world, or the Pentagon, which is the largest defense building in the world, and like you know, just like you're not expecting any of that. So when it's happening, I thought it was interesting that people connected the dots that, hey, this is an attack. I'm like, wow, like I must have been an idiot, because I'm like, how did we know this? This could have just been an accident, but everybody did. And I remember the PA address coming on super vividly, and they said that this was an attack. The Pentagon had been hit. I don't think that they had known about Flight 93, because I can't remember if they had made an announcement regarding that, but they definitely were aware of the towers and the Pentagon at that point, especially because that's local, right? That's happening more or less in our backyard. I think from my high school to the Pentagon is like maybe 35 minutes.
Right.
Like we have the Beltway, we're right there. Bang. And it was interesting. So like doing some of these interviews, talking to my dad, right? One of the things I was sort of foggy on trying to kind of recollect was like my experience with my dad on 9/11, because when I interviewed my dad as part of this project, I realized about 5 seconds into it that I have had my version of his day wrong for like 20 years, almost since the day it happened, just because of the amount of chaos there was that day, plus like the amount of chaos that the rest of my life has been for the last 20 years and things like that, you know. But it was interesting that my dad actually has some connections to the Pentagon experience. So let's take a listen right now real quick to that.
So I'm in Georgetown, and, you know, word's getting out, you know, with the second plane, it's pretty obvious it's an attack on the U.S., and everybody in Georgetown sort of freaking out. And at this point, unbeknownst to me, but there's people flying out of the White House and flying out of the Capitol. Mass evacuations are going on. We were like, we got to get everybody out of here. So we hear this rumble. And this plane, we're like, everybody just looked up at the ceiling in the office building and went, that's not right. And then you just hear boom, because Georgetown's pretty close to being right across the river from the Pentagon. And there was this massive explosion. And everybody was like, what? So now, of course, in our building, there's people streaming out, screaming and stuff like that.
So it's fascinating to me because when I sat down with my dad, I immediately realized that I'd had my interpretation of this story wrong for the better part of the last 20 years. So I've been placing my dad in New York City. So, like, you know, when we first talked about this, Matt, and I kind of told you what my experience was like, you remember I tell you, like, you know, we didn't know where my dad was for a little while. And like my memory has him in New York City and he's missing. And that's not, as we just heard, right? My dad's in DC. Like, that wasn't the case. But as you'll hear in a little while here, you know, my dad has a extremely, I guess, professional presence in New York City. He's there very regularly, things like that. It's not a once in a while thing. So my memory, I guess, just placed him there, and I've been wrong. So if you're listening, and we've talked about this in the last 20 years, my bad. Didn't get that wrong on purpose. But I also thought it was interesting how they were able to pick up on the out of normal sort of sounds that were happening in the background. I guess, you know, you don't think about that. You know, I imagine that if we were able to hear the road at 355 where you work a little better, it sounds like a lot of white noise. I remember when we were doing the battle anniversary this year, Matt, there was that car accident that happened or whatever, like right up the road. And you would think that we would have heard that, but we didn't hear any of it. We just kind of heard the first responder response to it when they went by, and then the generic white noise of all the cars passing. But
and all the cars stacking up too.
Yeah, but I just thought it was, you know, interesting that my dad and all the people that were with him kind of all noticed sort of right away that, hey, that was different. And then when the boom, you know, the plane hits the Pentagon, you know, everybody's kind of like, wow, this is something not right. So I think the Pentagon is one of the more interesting stories too, because, you know, we're not going to get into the conspiracies or anything like that, mainly because I just don't want to validate crazy people. Like, put it to you plainly, like if you're listening to this show and you think that there's some false flag operation and that jet fool can't, you know, melt this, like, just stop listening. I don't need you as a listener on this show. Period. But the Pentagon is another one of those, like, magnets for this. Like, there are people that think it didn't even happen.
Yeah.
And it's insane to me because, like, I've been down there. Flight 93, where our buddy Rich Condon was a ranger for a little while, and we'll get to him here in a second. Flight 93 is the only memorial and ground zero site that I haven't been to, but I've been to the Pentagon twice, and I've been to the World Trade Center a few times. And the Pentagon catches you super off guard because when you go to the World Trade Center site, you get, you know, if you're a tourist in New York City, which I have been a few times, it's overwhelming. I mean, the buildings are like things you've never seen. Like, my dad used to joke, he's like, you can always find a tourist in New York City because they're the ones looking up, right? It's true. But I've been the people looking up because they're bumping into you because they're like, where are you walking? That's where you get the, hey, I'm walking here from, and all that all the other fun New Yorkisms. But, you know, by the time you travel through New York City and you get down to the ground zero sites, some of the overwhelmingness that is Manhattan kind of wears off because you're like, okay, huge buildings, and you've kind of settled into that, and like more people and the claustrophobic nature of the whole concrete jungle scene and all that. You kind of get used to it, and then you get to the site and it's huge, and it's a beautiful, sad place, and I'll explain all that later. But it's another huge thing in New York City. And not to put that down in any way, but when you go to the Pentagon, you get really focused on the building because it's a freaking huge building, but it's not in New York City. It's not surrounded by
other huge buildings.
Yeah, and this one's also not huge in the like it's 100,000 feet tall kind of sense that the World Trade Center was. It was like you would get vertigo. Like I have seen the Sears Tower. I forget what it's called now, the Willis or whatever. If you're from Chicago, please reach out. Tell me what the Sears Tower is called now. But I was there when it was called the Sears Tower, and I can absolutely remember looking up and being like, oh, like I got so dizzy. I imagine the World Trade Center the same thing. But the Pentagon is like just this massive wall. Like, because when you're close to it, you don't get to see the other four sides of the 5-sided building. So it just looks like this massive wall. But when you're approaching the building, to go to the memorial and you're focusing on this building, suddenly you realize you're in the memorial and you're almost surrounded by it. Like you've almost walked into it before you realize it. And by the time you realize you're in this gorgeous memorial, you're really surrounded by it. And everywhere you look are these reminders that, hey, this didn't just happen in New York. And it catches you off guard. And it's one of the stories like Flight 93, which our buddy Rich, was kind enough to sit down with us for this project here and talk to us about. But it's the Pentagon was another one of those experiences that people don't really get to connect to. And I was absolutely caught off guard myself when my dad led off with the Pentagon connection. So
sure.
Flight 93 is a place I'd never been. Have you been there before, Shanksville, Pennsylvania?
I have not been yet. It's something that I've been holding off on.
Yeah, people connect with like tangible historical sites in different ways. We'll get into it in a little bit, but like I've been to Ground Zero a few times for a few different reasons, but I feel connected to that place. I've only been to the Pentagon twice, honestly, to pay respects, and then for context a different time. But I've never been to Flight 93, mainly because I just that one really hurts. Like I like their story. I don't know a lot about the experience of what it was like on the hijacked planes that hit the towers and hit the Pentagon, but we've obviously, with Flight 93, we've gotten very familiar with the fact that these people actually got a chance to fight for their lives. And that was actually one of the more interesting things that I heard in this project when we interviewed Rich. I asked Rich if it was different going to this field of honor, because, we're used to going to battlefields, which are fields of honor. And, we know what took place there and who did what. And we know why that ground, it's very clear we know why that ground is, hallowed. And I was like, what's it like going to a sort of different type of hallowed ground? And Rich sort of immediately pounced on the fact that I was trying to separate that this is not a battlefield, so it's, somehow hallowed in a different way. Mm-hmm. And not like he didn't come at me. Rich is too nice of a guy to do that. And but he did challenge me, and he said he does view the field in Shanksville as a battlefield. Let's take a look.
We talk about these great battles and the basically the bravery it takes to go into those battles, knowing that you could possibly die. And so I would say that there was actually a fight that happened over the ground of where Flight 93 crashed. I mean, you had passengers and crew members fighting for terrorists for control of a plane and really for control of a situation that was uncertain at the time. Did they know if they were going to successfully take the plane back and be able to have dinner with their families that night? No, they didn't know that. But it takes a lot of bravery, I think, especially personally, for someone who hates flying, to have the gall to fight to fight several hundred feet in the air. At that point, before they crashed, they were and not knowing what was happening in the world around them. The people on Flight 93 are hearing reports later on, shortly before the crash, about the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. They're hearing about these planes being used as missiles, essentially, and they knew that they had to do something. And so I always considered Flight 93 to be a battlefield in its own way, but it was also it's a national cemetery. It's Flight 93 National Memorial, but when you go visit that site, you are visiting their final resting place as well.
So Matt, what do you think about that? When Rich says that these people did get to fight for their lives, and their basic rights, other soldiers in our nation's past have. What were you thinking when you were listening to that?
Well, I agree with them, honestly. It wasn't an angle that I was anticipating when I first started listening to Rich speak, but he's a very good historian. We know that. He's done a lot of work with the American Civil War in his own research and with the Park Service, and I really appreciate that connection because it wasn't an aspect I was thinking of. It wasn't an aspect I was considering. Most certainly, I was considering it as this is something special because these folks got a chance to and did fight back. But I wasn't necessarily equating the battlefield aspect of it, and I really appreciate that. I think that's a very good point.
I'm going to do this in this episode because I just got to be true to myself in all things, Matt. I get a final scene of glory vibe when I think about Flight 93 because there's, in my mind, when they're rushing the hijackers, there is a fleeting moment of hope that maybe they're going to get home for dinner and see their loved one,
or some of them might.
Yeah, and there's that, like in the movie Glory, right? Like they make it into the fort and they're all rushing along the parapet and the music is swelling and everything's going great, and then obviously they run into the Confederate artillery that's pre-positioned, and it's like, oh no,
bam.
And I kind of I hope that's not disrespectful to people. I just, the way I teach is I try to connect people to things that help them understand better. So if you're familiar with that vibe from the movie Glory, that's how I envision sort of what happens at the climax of the Flight 93 hijacking and crash is these people fought, and that's why it moves me so much because there's such I feel emotions very differently than most people do. I think there are people out there that consider themselves empaths will understand that whatever you're feeling, I feel. And the things that I feel on 11 for all you Spinal Tap fans out there. I feel them. So when I feel the fleeting hope and then it turns into the just hopelessness of not being able to control the plane, that moves me so much that it's hard to articulate what I actually feel when I think about this stuff. And Rich did a really good job kind of connecting me to a place that I also have not been. One of the things that it almost scares me in a way because I feel things the way I do is that Rich talked about just the constant sort of heavy emotional toll that working at a place like that has, on you.
Absolutely.
Because, you think about it. One, this was a bad day for everybody.
Right.
But then this isn't 150 years ago Civil War history. This isn't 100 year ago First World War history. This is contemporary to our lives. I was a teenager. You were in your 20s. You're a college student. There are people who are still relatively young. There are young people who experience this, so this is still a very fresh thing. We're doing this project because it's only been 20 years.
Right.
And a lot of people are saying wow, that's a long time. And I'm the opposite. Like 20 years to me has gone by so fast. Like I cannot believe it has been 20 years because it feels still very prevalent because our entire lives changed on that day. And Addressing Gettysburg host Matt Callery, a good buddy of ours, touches on that a bit.
9/11 to me is the straw that broke the camel's back, because ever since 9/11 we have turned on ourselves. Like prior to that, you know, we always squabbled within the United States, right? That's, you know, the country was born out of a family fight, right? You know, and so of course we're going to keep on fighting with each other and arguing and having a civil war and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. But I think whatever it was that was tamping down the divisions in the country since the Civil War, 9/11 just blew the lid off of it.
Yeah.
And it's been a very, I mean, I can tell you from 20 years ago, the mood of the country, it's just not the same. The outlook, the optimism that some people had just died with 9/11.
Yeah. You know, it's always fun to talk to Matt. You know, Matt and I grieve similarly. You know, we use humor as a defense mechanism, as a way to cope. So when we sat down and talked, Matt and I had a lot of laughs, some laughs that a lot of people might think were inappropriate for the subject we're talking about. But
sure,
you got to understand for guys like Matt also feels things kind of like I do, you know, pretty bigly, as you could say. But he feels them, man. And so like when we talked about this, like you could tell that it was pulling on his heartstrings pretty hard, and we started to have a little more fun with it because it was getting a little too real. You know, Matt's from up in the Jersey area. He's from right outside New York City. And, you know, when we talk about some of the things that happen in the days and weeks that follow, like Matt starts talking about, you know, this commuter parking lot and the cars that are still there. So
there was a commuter lot. I grew up in Parsippany, New Jersey. There was a commuter lot in Parsippany. On Route 46, goes. You can hop on the bus there, go straight into the city. There were, I don't know how many, but it was more than a couple cars, same spot, sitting there for days afterwards. I stayed another 2 days after the attack, but I remember people telling me that some of those cars were still there because, you know, and that was an eerie, that made it even more real because you're seeing that these cars are not going anywhere because the people that were in them are dead or just stuck in the city. There were, I don't remember how many people Parsippany lost, but I don't think it was a whole lot. I don't recall.
You know, with the world changing, like, you know, we talked, like Matt was just telling us about, you know, we're sort of previewing what the rest of this chat's going to look like, things like that, because, you know, obviously the world that we live in today in 2021 is almost everywhere you look. The terror attacks of September 11, 2001 have a fingerprint on it. So before we get to that, like the day itself is still unfolding.
Right.
You're getting, you know, home from class like right at 10 o'clock in the morning. I am getting home. I'm also getting home from school right around this time. So a lot of parents were starting to come in and pick up their children.
Okay. Makes sense.
They just were there was a plan. You know, they had decided to do an early dismissal. And I know the logistics of arranging all those buses like that was probably a monumental feat. And those people are heroes in ways that they'll unfortunately never have books written about. But I mean, they got school systems home. They got kids home to their families real quick. And that happened all over the country, I imagine, but definitely where I live, that happened. But a lot of parents, I don't think wanted to wait for that, and just started filtering in and grab their kids, and like they were so many of the rules were broken. Like I definitely know my buddy's parents didn't sign him out in the front office. Like while I was getting picked up by my mom, my buddy's dad showed up and just took him, he walked into the cafeteria and out of the cafeteria, which is nowhere near the office. So I know none of those sign in, sign out things, you know, happened, but it was just a day where rules like that didn't matter. All that mattered was just like family and safety and information, because we had a lot and not a lot all at the same time.
Right.
And so, you know, for me, this is a moment that, like, I'm very shocked and confused. I'm not expecting to see my mom. She's there. I'm being honest with myself that I have been worrying about my dad without actively thinking about it all morning. It's just kind of been that thing that's gnawing in the back of my brain. And my mom looks like she's been crying, which is like stressing me out more. So like when I get closer to my mom and I'm like asking for a more honest answer. I'm like, where's Dad? She's like, I don't know. And I was like, great. But I guess that was something that was figured out relatively quickly. I thought it was a longer period of time, like hours, but I guess within the hour we had heard from my dad because my dad was local to us. My dad was pretty on brand, you could say, if you know my dad on 9/11. My dad is a very much act. There are fight or flight kind of people, and my dad is a fight kind of guy. So not like barroom fight kind of guy, but like
stoic.
When the chaos of the day really started to ensue, the towers have been hit, they started to come down, Pentagon's been hit, planes down in Pennsylvania. We don't know what the next topics are or next targets are. And we also don't know what the next attack's going to look like. Is it going to be, a shooting? Are they going to start getting into malls? Kind of like what ISIS does now, where they're the smaller scale, actual, like real, like
soft target
kind of terror attacks, or was it going to be something bigger, like we worry about the dirty bomb? Were we going to start seeing the bright flashes, which is ironic because we're sort of as we're talking about this now, Matt, you and I were in between the atomic bomb dates, but like, that was something that, I know was on my dad's mind, was like, is that something we're against? So like my dad realized, like, people everywhere, we got to get out of these buildings. So my dad is in an office building that's full of like Marines and prior service type folk. And there's some of them are, evacuating, but some of the ones that are, your cliche, prototypical prior service guys are springing back into their old action type of hero format. And they're coordinating evacuations. And there's my dad, like right alongside him. And 2 hours go by and, my dad's finally making his way out of the building and he runs into one of these guys who's a prior service Marine. And he's like, hey, Mikey, where the hell you been? And my dad's like, oh, like floors 6 and 7 are clear. Like, we can go. And the guy says to my dad, he's like, yeah, no shit. He's like, we've been out here half an hour ago. We've been looking for you. My dad's been looking, like going floor to floor, making sure people are out. So
good for him.
So my mom picks us up and gets us home right around the time that you're getting out of class. So I remember we get in the door probably right around 9:45. And I remember we were inside maybe 5-10 minutes at the most. We're watching NBC and we watched the first tower come down.
And I don't think I actually saw it. I got back to the dorm. According to the timelines, the first tower came down at 9:59. So I would have been just exiting class essentially at that point. So I remember seeing the news coverage of that so quickly thereafter. It feels like I saw it, but I don't think I actually saw the first tower come down.
How far, walk time on campus? Because I'm assuming you were living on campus at this time?
I was living on campus, but I had my bike, so I was hauling.
Hey, calm down. You're married, all right? Like, ladies, get off, right? He has a bike, all right? We get it. I hope you have a big trunk because I'm putting my bike in it.
That's right. But no, I was hauling through campus to get back to
How long do you think it took you?
5 minutes at most.
So yeah, I mean, if you're seeing it, you are seeing it almost in real time, because if you're home before 10:10 in the morning, it's like 11 minutes has transpired since it happened, and you're seeing all the replays. So
all that confusion and the terror and whatnot of the tower coming down, that's when 93 crashes.
Right.
And all of that information starts flooding in. And you were talking about rules being broken in your school and whatnot for parents trying to get their kids out. Very natural for that to happen. But one of the things that I remember pretty vividly during this confusing time as you're flipping through the different news stations, and this was the first time I had cable, was in college. My folks were pretty adamant we weren't having cable growing up, and so I had all sorts of different channels now, and so we were flipping through a lot of different channels. Hell, even History Channel was covering this thing live. ESPN did some of the best coverage of the day.
Absolutely want to touch on that real quick, so we're just going to break the timeline up real fast. So I tell people this all the time, kind of like for the folks in 1989 that were, looking for coverage when the San Francisco earthquake happened. Like Al Michaels and those guys were on the air. And, he wasn't like Al Michaels is known as one of the most famous sportscasters in history. I mean, Al Michaels is a freaking legend. Also, if you've seen him in basketball, you have a hard time forgetting that when you think about his Hall of Fame career. But he's the guy that sort of is holding the emotional glue together for people who are watching on television in 1989. And in 2001, he was there the same again. Because I remember NBC is looking for people on the ground in New York City, and Al Michaels happens to be in New York City. And, Al Michaels is not known for covering breaking news unless it's breaking news. Eli Manning's coming out of retirement, and the Giants are going to win another new Super Bowl, right? Like, it's sports related. So ESPN, Al Michaels with NBC at the time, but ESPN, just all the sports networks. I mean, I remember watching Cartoon Network at some point during the day just because I was like flipping like you. I was like,
well, I've got a story about Cartoon Network.
But they were covering it. It was crazy to see because they were all carrying basically the big fours feeds. For a while, ESPN, before they got their own anchors up and running, they were carrying ABC's feed because they're an ABC Disney subsidiary, things like that. So it was interesting. At one point, Cartoon Network, I think, was carrying CNN's coverage, which would make sense because I think they're all owned by
Turner.
Ted, before you die, can you just unload and give us the last full measure, please? You can't take any of that money with you. We might as well just complete the story and give us nerds another trilogy. This would be the inferiorist of all of them. Is that a word, inferiorist?
It'll work.
Most inferior. But it would be nice if you did that, Ted. But I remember watching part of this day on Cartoon Network.
Yeah, the confusion and the chaos coming out of that, the different accounts of what was going on and sometimes contradictory information that was happening. Getting back to my point about the rules, though.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine. One of the things I noticed was that the newscasters and the media folks began talking like you hear when they're in war zones. And when they're at really bad natural disasters. Because you had the folks in shop that are kind of trying to run things and work with their folks on the ground, and you started hearing it. You started hearing the, hey, be careful out there. Hey, we're really glad you were able to make it in. Hey, just be safe out there, that sort of thing. And you don't hear that on your normal day-to-day newscasts.
No.
You did that day, and you heard that a lot as the day continued, especially because of the confusion and whatnot, because nobody really knew, just like you said, we didn't know what was going to happen next. And then the towers start falling apart. The news about Shanksville comes in. Of course, we've got the Pentagon by this point has a raging fire in it, and nobody is quite certain what's going on there. It was very interesting to see the country begin to coalesce, begin to start coming together, just because we were in this very human moment of we don't know what's going on, and so we're going to latch onto those around us.
We're scared.
Be it with families trying to get their kids, like you had with school, be it with the news networks working with their people, trying to do their job, but also trying to have some form of humanity while doing that job. And going above and beyond, in many cases, with the search and rescue, with the fire, with the police departments, with the newscasters, all trying to do their job to get the best information to save people's lives. It was a very inspiring's not quite the word, but it's what I've got.
Retrospectively, it's inspiring. I think that's fair to say, because when we look back on it, journalistically, it was a moment Walter Cronkite would be very proud of.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned Cronkite, because it seems like it was that night, but I have a feeling it was probably that afternoon. Like you said, the timeline's very skewed.
Yeah.
Do you remember who came on the air and that everything seemed to get a little bit more settled? Tom Brokaw.
That's right.
He wasn't working.
He's our Cronkite.
Right.
Yeah.
He wasn't working that day. It was a Tuesday.
That's right.
In September. Who cares? He was off for some reason, whether it was his normal day or he had taken some time. He got pulled in to start covering this, and he's there. He's got his shirt sleeves rolled up. He wasn't spending time in the makeup chair and They threw him onto screen as a settling factor, as a look. We're doing the best we can. Here's the guy everybody knows. Even if you didn't watch his show, everybody knew who he was, and it was very much of an attempt at a calming factor.
It works. It works. If you look back on it, people all over this country and the world talked about just the comforting familiarity of Tom Brokaw.
Right, exactly.
On the air. So I got that looking back on it when we were getting ready for this program vibe, and I was thinking about the fact that I watched Katie Couric stay on the air for hours after the Today Show and things like that. And it's like, I grew up learning about journalism, and basically everybody should be Walter Cronkite. You know, that was sort of the vibe, or Jules Verne. Everybody should be serious journalists. And you know, on 9/11, as a wannabe writer, I guess sometimes that flirts with maybe I wanted to be a journalist or whatever. But I looking back, especially with the way people attack the media and things like that now, and sometimes deservedly so. But the moment, as far as the people who were responsible with conveying good information to us, like I think that was not just a home run. I think it was a grand slam. And Brokaw definitely sticks out in my mind. Greatest generation. He's a good guy. Mm-hmm. So when the second towers come down is when this day really sort of starts to hurt in a weird way for me. And it took me a long time to realize the hurt because it, like with everybody, the terror attacks of this day, people are still processing because the ripples of that event are still playing out. Like, you know, we're in the month August of 2021 as we're recording now, and the Afghan war that was started as a result of this day, 2001, is ending.
Right.
Like officially, like the final American and Allied troops, coalition troops, are going to be out of Afghanistan in August of 2001. This is our longest constant military engagement in our nation's history.
Right. By far.
And there are I'm going to say kids just because the older I get, the more I realize how much 18-year-olds are kids. And honestly, you were 20 at the time. Sometimes that feels like we were kids. When I think about me at 20, I'm like, oh my God, we were kids. But
absolutely.
There are kids who are currently serving in the military in that war that weren't even alive when it happened. So, and we're going to talk to Eric Money in a minute here, who is the producer for Addressing Gettysburg with Matt Callery, and he actually served in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and he's got some pretty interesting perspectives. So, but when the towers come down, the second tower specifically is when it really starts to hit me in a deep way, because my dad's a New Yorker. As you know, my dad's not a historian. Amateur like me or professional like you. My dad's just a pretty cool guy, right? But he's a New Yorker through and through. And one of the things that you won't hear in this, at the beginning of the recording I did with my dad, I kind of took a shot at him because I think he's been living outside of New York longer than he's been living in New York now, because like I'm in my 30s and my dad hasn't lived in New York City my entire life. Plus, you know, he's been in North Carolina for like 10 years old. So I was like, you know, I feel like, you know, you gotta kind of weird with saying you're a New Yorker, but you know, if you're a New Yorker, you never stop.
It's in the blood.
You never stop. So, like, just for context, like this day affected my dad, and this is what I was getting at, was like when the second tower collapses, the first tower to be hit. To be clear, the second tower that is hit by the plane collapses first. The The first tower that was hit collapses second, but it's when that tower collapses at around 10:30 in the morning. What is it? 10:28 to be specific.
10:28. Yeah.
10:28. When that building collapses is when I start to realize that my dad is probably feeling things that I don't understand, because my dad is a New Yorker, and my dad grew up in the city, when New York was kind of like the Wild West. I mean, really like the Wild West. At one point, I think, in like 1976, I think Gerald Ford basically tells the city, you're on your own, clean your shit up, and then we'll start talking. But New York City's got that reputation in the 70s. But you remember when we were talking, he starts talking about what it was like to see the towers start to break the skyline. As they're being built, you kind of know they're being built, but it's just more buildings being built in New York City. But when when the two towers start to pop out above the other building. Yeah, he's like, that's when it hit a bunch of most of New Yorkers that these were something special, and it wasn't just one, but there were two of them.
At a certain point, the building broke the skyline. Because remember, in 67, 68, Lower Manhattan skyline does not look like it looks today. There's a lot of other tall buildings in Lower Manhattan that didn't exist back in the 60s. So I'll bet at about the 40th to 50th floor, the World Trade Center broke the skyline.
Poked above everybody else.
You could see it from the train every day, and it would just continue to grow. And what was fascinating about it was there were two of them. Right? I mean, you grew up there, we were used to the Empire State Building and all that kind of stuff, right? Sears hadn't been built in Chicago yet. And these was, going to be the two buildings that broke the tallest building in the world record at that time, right? So, and they're going up side by side by side. It was just fascinating to see.
Everybody in the world kind of knew what the World Trade Center were, and he
iconic. They absolutely were.
I mean, if you think about all the random places they pop up from, like pictures and movies, like I always tell people, like, it's such a stupid go-to, but think about it. A lot of people have seen the movie Men in Black. The whole scene where Will Smith has to decide whether he's going to become a Men in Black agent or not, he's sitting in front of the World Trade Center doing like some deep reflecting. He's looking right across the river at it, and it's just like it shows up everywhere. My dad...
The Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy has the towers in it. They had to pull one of the trailers because it was a direct reference to the towers, and they had just collapsed.
Yeah, we have, and we can touch on that in a little bit, but I grew up playing the Command & Conquer computer game series.
Absolutely.
Red Alert 2 had to be completely redesigned, and the cutscenes and things like that, because the opening, I think of that, had a Zeppelin attack. Like, I think there were scenes of them blowing up parts of the World Trade Center, but this is obviously, that was all created before.
Right.
Like, that wasn't done in poor taste. Like, that was done in, like, obviously that game came out in like 2000 or 2001. It was long in production before that, but a lot of things changed in the aftermath. But when it came down, even at 15 years old, I was aware of the fact that my dad was probably like losing something that meant more than I could understand. And as the years went on, I was validated in that, because my dad talked a lot about of just this sort of just pride, the city that's going through a whole bunch of crazy shit, and something marvelous is taking place. And they went up quick too. He talks about how fast they go up, because he said it's kind of like local to us, the intercounty connector that was built down in Montgomery County. It was something that was talked about for like 20 or 30 years. People fight about it. Yes, no, county councils do all the things that governments do, and red tape. And then it finally took like 5 years to build the whole damn thing. Quick. Same kind of concept for the World Trade Center. It's just like a back and forth thing, on the local government levels forever. And then when they finally broke ground, it happened quick. And it was just something that like made a lot of people proud. And talking to my dad, I got some unexpected family memories out of it. Like my dad talked about riding the train into New York City, because he's in college. He's your age when the World Trade Centers are completed. And he would talk about like your age, not now, but like obviously your age, college, 20. He's 20 years old.
Yeah, I knew what you meant.
Sorry for those of you listening if I'm not clear. My dad's 20 years old in this moment. But he would talk about just riding the train into New York City with his dad, like my grandfather, who I was very close with. And they would get off at different stops, but they would kind of, as it was being built and as it was being completed, they would talk about it and they would point it out and they would just kind of track the progress. And it was just it was a moment between father and son that is special to me, because my grandfather's gone. And unfortunately, both my grandfather and my great grandfather had to live to see this. It's not like, you know, I feel weird saying that. And again, I'm getting off the rails. I'll get us back here in a second. But like, my family is deeply rooted in New York. Like, if you know me personally, I root for all the New York sports teams because they were given to me by guys who were from the city of New York. And we, the McGuires, are very proud of what we built out of my great-grandfather's sort of, you know, legacy from, you know, when he was born here in the city in the early 1900s to what he built for us and handed off to Grandpa, who handed off to my dad, who handed off to me, and I spilled it everywhere because he can't trust me with anything. I picked most of it back up. But it's, you know, it's something that we're very proud of. And so those two guys specifically, my great-grandfather and my grandfather, who got to watch a lot of New York being built up, especially my great-grandpa, who got to see like pre-Depression era New York. So like the Art Deco sort of Renaissance, you know, the Chrysler Building going up, and all the Empire State Building and all that stuff. Like I feel bad looking back on it that he got to see all of those things go up, but he also got to see the trade towers come down. But so when the first tower collapses, when the first tower hit collapses at 10:30, it really starts to hit me, and I start to feel really lost. And I remember standing in my mom's living room, and my mom didn't see it. She was in the other room. We knew the first tower had come down because like we had just seen it. But I remember when the second tower hit, and I just kind of went, "Oh my God," like a really weird 15-year-old blurt out kind of thing. And my mom came running into the room, and I remember her standing with her hand over her mouth, and it was silent in that room. It felt like hours, maybe minutes, literally just minutes, but like.
Well, and we got to remember all of this is happening before noon for most of, well, for the entire East Coast. I mean, both the towers are down, the Pentagon is on fire, and 93 has been plowed into that field near Shanksville before 11 a.m.
I want to say it was Katie Couric that I was watching when the second tower fell, and I feel like it was her just saying like, "Oh my God," and then also joining us in the silence because everybody was just stunned. And then like touching to what you're saying, I can't imagine waking up on the West Coast and this is almost all played out.
Right.
Like if you get up, this whole thing is done by 10:30. Right.
Well, a little after. It's almost 11 when we have the partial collapse of the Pentagon.
But I mean, okay, yeah, you're right. Okay, so
by 10:30, both the towers have come down, and obviously the second one is going to be crumbling for a while.
But let's say you get up at 8 o'clock to go to work.
Right.
Like you're waking up to this whole thing. And imagine you're further across the ocean.
We kind of got up late and, we're 5 hours ahead. So when it's 9 a.m. in New York, it's 2 p.m. in the UK. So, we kind of get up late and, my girlfriend's kind of hanging out in the bathroom, taking her time. And I'm kind of downstairs by myself. And I just kind of sit on the couch and just put the TV on, just like any kind of like normal day. And I'm watching a soap opera that's popular or was popular back then. And I can't remember what it was, but they cut off the end of it. And they went straight to a news broadcast. And I was like, this is something. So it showed a live view of, quite recognizable for British people, the Twin Towers. I mean, we watch movies, so we're all very familiar of what the Twin Towers in New York are and what they're called and where they are. So I'm watching, right? And it says like plane hits the South Tower, I think it was. And I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, I hope they are able to put the fire out because these buildings are iconic, right? And it's horrible to see like iconic architecture damaged or on fire or anything like that. So then like I'm kind of watching it, and I'm not really alerted or have the realization of what's happening quite yet, right? So as I'm watching it, I see this next plane hit the other tower, and then it was getting worse and worse. So everything they kept saying was just progressively getting worse and worse. And, you know, I then started to think like, oh my God, this is like the end of the world or the start of World War III, because you just don't see this. It just doesn't happen. Like, not since I was alive as a kid.
Right.
Like, if it did happen, it happened in like the Middle East, which was a whole world away from, you know, my little world in England.
Sure.
As a kid. And I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. So I remember I tried to call my mom. She was at work, and I was like panicking, and I was like, I need to call my mom and tell her like exactly what's going on, because I think the world is about to erupt into World War III.
I then remember some of the things like the roads being cleared. I remember the air traffic. That was pretty crazy for us because living in the DC area, where I lived in Montgomery County, we have both Reagan and Dulles flying, over us in their approaches. And so there's planes all the time, and it was quiet. There were no planes. You're from like the Battle Creek area of Michigan. Are you near, I know nothing about Michigan other than the fact that you're from there. And it looks like a mitten.
It does look like a mitten. Where I grew up, we had Fort Custer, which doesn't have a lot of commercial flights out of it, or there was an air guard base there, so there were a lot of planes up that day. Once the aerial lockdown occurred.
Yeah.
But I was in East Lansing, so I wasn't aware of that at the time. I was up in East Lansing at Michigan State, and we were aware of the aerial lockdown because the news started to report it, or they were reporting about the president's Air Force One being escorted by serious fighters and things of that nature back to wherever they took him. They're talking about the Capitol being evacuated and the VP plane being taken somewhere else and all this other stuff. So we were aware that there was an aerial lockdown, but it wasn't something that we were like, oh wow, there's no planes in the sky, that sort of thing, at least at that time. What I recall is that everything happened so fast that morning, and then it was just repetition. Like we get today, you watch any of the news cycles for an hour, maybe two, and it starts repeating again. Well, that's all they had, was everything that had occurred that morning and then just speculation. So it began to repeat itself probably around noon or a little thereafter, and it was just such pounding, this is what we got, this is what we got, this is what we got, but with no really further. I mean, I don't recall when the president first came on to speak or any of the other big wigs. I don't remember any of that happening that day.
I remember him speaking. It was still daylight. I want to say it was the afternoon.
Probably was. But I do remember going out at one point, and I swear it was day of, but it could have been the day after. But from what I remember, it was day of, and I went over to the student union just to try to do something and figure out what was going on or what I could do. And we had, I say again, the kids thing, we had students lined up through the union, up the stairwells to the multiple floors in line to give blood. The Red Cross was out in force, and they knew this was going to be bad, and they were taking advantage of people's need to do something.
Yeah.
To need to be doing something to help, which was a good idea. And they must have sat for hours waiting to do that. They had such a line, they were turning people away at that point. They were saying, put your name and email down and we'll get in touch with you. I think it was the one time that the Red Cross basically turned people away and said, we've got enough blood.
Listen, we have enough blood.
Yeah. Because they still call me all the time because I give regularly. But yeah, there were so many people just trying to do anything they could to help and having no real idea how to. They just would go to the basic system of, hey, let's go give blood or anything.
The useless helplessness combo is something that we have a lot of experience with in our family. I'm not close with them, but I have a couple cousins who are retired now, New York City Police and New York City Fire. And at the time they were, because if you're familiar with how a lot of those families in New York go, they can be both cops and firefighters. Like my one cousin was a cop for like 5 years and then a firefighter for like 15 years. So like, you can be both of these things. But at the time, I think him and his brother were cops, and they were out for no reason at all. New York-based family, they're Denver Broncos fans. And so they drove out, or they flew out to Denver to go to a Monday Night Football game. And they were going to hang out in Denver for a couple days and then, catch a flight back. But obviously all air traffic was grounded. And they're New Yorkers. They work in the city, and they're stuck out in Colorado. On television,
that must have killed them.
They watched their friends, die and disappear, and they didn't, know for hours and days, what was going on. But what my cousin told me when I asked him about it, he's like, I wasn't there on the day. And I have a lot of family that were there on the day. My family is your prototypical Irish Catholic New York family. They're cops, they're firefighters, they're construction workers.
Bunches of you.
Yeah, there's a million of us because birth control is not a thing in an Irish Catholic family. You know this. Everybody knows this. But there's a lot of us down there on the day, but these two guys in particular were not. And they talked about how useless they felt watching on television, how helpless they felt knowing that there wasn't really anything they could do. So, like you were saying, people started looking to do whatever it was that they could attach to that they knew or felt like would be of help. So they, knowing they couldn't fly, rented a car and drove nonstop from Denver back to New York City.
Wow.
My cousin Vinny, I have a cousin Vinny.
Awesome.
Just like the movie, except my cousin Vinny is not as cool as Joe Pesci. But my cousin Vinny was getting married that day. He was a New York City police officer who wasn't on his beat that morning because he was at the courthouse getting married. Gets married, rushes out of the service.
Got to go to work.
That's his honeymoon.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of connections to this, but I know that locally for me, I'm not 20 years old. I'm 15 at the time. And so I am in this transition between wanting to be a 40-year-old grown-up and wanting to be a 5-year-old kid that still plays with G.I. Joes. I know you can relate because we still struggle with that in our 30s and 40s now. G.I. Joes are awesome. But I remember when I got home, there was we weren't going to school the next day. There was no homework assigned to us. It was just kind of like the day the world stopped. I mean, it did. Everything just stopped.
Yeah, it did.
I mean, the stock exchange stopped. We just kind of, all right, everybody go home until we figure out what is happening and what to do next. And so when we got home, there wasn't anything for me to figure out. I'm not a government employee. I'm a 15-year-old kid. So it's a beautiful day. It was a September day in the Mid-Atlantic. It was Tuesday. And I suddenly had hours of daylight to play that I didn't normally have. So, on September 10th, 2001, I could go out without making a thing. I'm just like, all right, Mom, see you later. And there wasn't, where are you going? How long? I'll just, I'll see you at dark or dinner time. That whole, the good old days kind of thing that people talk about. But on September 11th, we got home, the buildings came down. We had a couple hours of just, everybody kind of was like, and then I suddenly was a 15-year-old kid and bored. I want to go see my buddy. He lived in the next neighborhood over, which is just a 2-minute bike ride. And I remember heading downstairs like I normally do. And I remember my mom intercepted me. She's like, where the hell are you going? And I said, I'm going to my buddy's house. And she's like, I don't really want you to do that. And is it okay with his mom? And I'm like, these are like questions that you get asked when you're 8 and 9 years old. Like, what the hell's going on here? And looking back on it, I'm a parent now, so I totally get it. My mom was scared.
Yeah, absolutely.
We didn't know what was happening next. And so like me going out to do something as mundane as just going to my buddy's house to play PlayStation, she wanted to keep me close. I did the predictable thing. I was an asshole about it long enough for her to let me go, which I kind of feel bad. Like my mom and I aren't close now, but looking back on it, it's like I feel bad because in the moment where my mom was scared and just wanted to keep her loved ones near, I was a real douche about going to play at my buddy's house. And she gave in, which in a way I feel bad, but I also am grateful for because it was a distraction for me to just play. Like my buddy and I played Madden for like hours. And that was all I did. Like even at 15, I understood what was happening, but I kind of needed to numb out from it because it was too much. Like I understood that this was something bigger than I could comprehend. And as I have my entire life always felt feelings in huge ways. Like this, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was done. Like I couldn't do this anymore on that day. So
I'm glad you brought that up, because I went out that afternoon, tried to figure out something to do, put my name on the list of, hey, call me if you need more blood, and then went back to the dorm and started devouring media again, internet and TV. And again, just flipping back and forth between the big news stations and all that. And Brandon was there. He's a good dude. He and I are different in a lot of ways in our personalities, and I think that's why we clicked really well in college, and we still are in contact nowadays. But I beat that poor guy to death that day with the amount of media I was consuming. And it was after dinner. It had to have been 8, 9 o'clock. He finally had enough. He was like, Matt, dude, we got to watch something else. I got to watch something else.
Yeah.
And I realized just how much I'd been grinding on this, and we flipped it over to Cartoon Network and just watched cartoons for the rest of the night.
Yeah.
And we needed it. I needed it. I didn't realize I needed it until I was watching some stupid ass cartoon, which of course I love cartoons and still love them, but I really needed it at that point, and Brandon did too, and he recognized it long before I did.
What channel was Ren and Stimpy on at that time?
I'm not even sure it was still on the air.
I'm pretty sure it was, because I think I watched Ren and Stimpy that night, because I have a memory of, I want to say it was Cartoon Network.
Well, it might have been on Boomerang or something, because I didn't think it was still being whatever.
It's all right, man. We're nerds. Ren and Stimpy was a great show. Also, if you think people are offended by some of the things that are out now, dude, just look up Ren and Stimpy. If you're 15 years old and you think you're edgy, you didn't know shit. Ren and Stimpy were wild. But I think I was watching Cartoon Network when they transitioned back into...
It went off the air in 96, dude.
Yeah, but it's one of those shows that like got replayed.
Yeah, like on Boomerang and stuff like that, yeah.
Because I thought I've seen it on Adult Swim before.
Probably.
Or like MTV used to randomly play it too.
MTV played it till 96. And that was the new stuff, and they probably continued to play it after that.
But like, I think I was watching Cartoon Network when they transitioned back to their normal programming, because I remember there was a statement, a black screen, white text, and it said something like, we are acknowledging blah, 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 whatever. But they were basically, what they were saying was they were intentionally doing this because people need places to go. And they had at that point, they had already been they had been using the CNN feed for hours. So I think was it probably the Adult Swim? I think they turned Adult Swim. I think they covered it all the way up until Cartoon Network becomes Adult Swim late at night.
Possibly.
I think that's what it was, because I think they prefaced Adult Swim with like a 3-minute message, and some programmer said something, whatever. But I remember that I just, I was cooked much earlier than you, and I needed to go play, and that was something that caused some division in my house that day. But I remember, and just to kind of not, minute by minute this for people, because we could have a 20-hour podcast, but like I remember in the hours, there were some things that stuck out to me. The silence in the sky was crazy. Even now, looking back on it, I live far out of flight lines. We live out in Carroll County, Maryland here, but we still have municipalities locally, so municipal airports locally. So there's air traffic out here, but it's not loud like the big, jet airliners that are coming into Dulles and Reagan. But I'll never forget how quiet it was. And then the roads, man, people were just not out for 3 or 4 days. People just stayed in their homes, which
I definitely remember that.
Without asking for it, in June of last year, personally, I got to relive that experience, because while a lot of us were still at home on quarantines, or I hate using the term lockdown. We weren't locked in our homes against our wills and things like that. We could take freaking walks, but people were quarantined. People were furloughed. I was furloughed for a couple months, things like that. And when my company unfurloughed us, and I remember we went back to work in June, where I lived at the time is similar to where I live now. It's about an hour commute, hour and 10-minute commute. And it's usually 40 to 50 miles an hour on a 70 mile an hour road just because of morning congestion and things like that. And I remember not just the first day, but weeks after I went back to work, and probably even months in some parts of the places that I work, there was just nobody on the road. And I know that this time it was because people were working from home and things like that, but it was just, I guess I was old enough to remember it on 9/11. So, 20 years later, 19 years at the time, of the June pandemic last year, I'm driving on Route 70 here in Maryland, Interstate 70, and I'm like, I've seen this before.
Right.
And that was difficult. I remember at some point I needed to do something normal. And for me, it was watching baseball. So like in the days that, turned into weeks and turned into months, like what are some of the things that you remember about I guess 9/11, and what are some of the things that you did to sort of help you cope, deal, whatever word you want to use to describe it?
It's a good question, because I don't really remember what I did to cope, per se, other than doing things like watching cartoons or diving into my personal reading and things like that. I don't read just histories. I'll read a sci-fi or a fantasy on occasion, that sort of thing.
You're a well-rounded nerd, is what you just admitted.
I try to be a well-rounded nerd. But I don't really remember coping. I remember when sports came back. I was not a big sports ball guy at that point. I know that's a shocker.
Are you a sports ball guy now?
No.
I was going to say that would be a shocker.
But I remember when they started showing games again, that was, even for me, I mean, I don't care about baseball beyond its historical context.
You take that back right now.
I will not. But I remember being like, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Let's play ball.
The question has already been answered. Should we be here? Yes. Should we show others how to demonstrate our resolve? Yes, and we shall do it here this evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to baseball.
Lopez wants it away. And it's hit deep to left center. Andrew Jones on the run. This one has a chance. Home run! Mike Piazza, and the Mets lead 3-2.
Gone for a home run. Sammy Sosa has hit one into the basket just to the right of the 368 sign. He's carrying an American flag around the bases, and the Cubs lead 1-0.
SNL that week, and their decision to do the show was very inspiring. And I know people have poo-pooed that since, but no, that was a ballsy move, and they did a really good show that week too. There was little things like that. Just we're getting on with our lives. We're not in we're ignoring what's happening, but we need to do this to help the greater.
On behalf of everyone here, I just want to thank you all for being here tonight, and especially you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you very much. Having our city's institutions up and running sends a message that New York City is open for business. Saturday Night Live is one of our great New York City institutions, and that's why it's important for you to do your show tonight.
Can we be funny?
Why start now?
Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
I also remember some of the bad stuff.
I mean, the Muslims are going to end up falling, and it's only going to be God's people that are going to make it. So, I mean, if you're a Muslim, you're in trouble, I mean, so that's the way I see it.
I was made aware that I was not a full American or not an average or normal American right after September 11th. It's like I went to sleep an American and I woke up an Arab, even though I was born and raised in America.
Wildly suspicious things being said about people who have been in the community for, decades, who are neighbors and who might be people's friends or professors or doctors.
You don't want a mosque in Murfreesboro?
No. No.
Why is that?
Because that's where they gather to take over America.
The Islamophobia started real quick.
I'm glad you're mentioning this because the amount of people that brought up, I remember 9/12 while we were doing the interviews.
Right.
It's accurate. There was a lot of unity in the aftermath.
A lot of flags.
But I remember what you're about to talk about just as vividly because I came from a very culturally diverse part of Maryland. And it was awful. And it's still awful because it's something that 20 years later is still happening. It's just the pendulum of American hate swings in different directions. And right now, the spotlight is not on Islam as directly as it has been, but on September 12th, 2001, that dial got ratcheted up.
Yep. And yes, there was a lot of wonderful things that happened in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. A lot of things that the country did to come together, but there was a lot of fear that got laced into this, not just because of attacks, but because of our fellow Americans.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing news reports and then seeing some of the signs for gas station attendants or convenience stores or what have you, when they're having to put signs up that says, "We're not Afghani."
Yeah, we're not Muslim.
Right. We're not Muslim. We're not Afghani. They're just trying to live their lives, do their thing. And fear does terrible things.
I was kind of stuck on this with how I wanted to approach the Islamophobia because it's one of the things we try to do. And this is we talk about this all the time about the delicate balance beam of being factual and being sensitive all at the same time. Recently you and I were discussing this because on my independent brand, History Things with Pat, I'm doing coverage of the atomic bomb drops of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the things that I was concerned with, but I felt compelled to do, and we discussed this, was I felt like we need to show what happened, not just buildings being destroyed and statistics being typed out because it's easy to hit zeros and commas, but there were approximately 80,000 lives lost in an instant, and then tens of thousands more lost in the days, weeks, months, and years that followed because of acute radiation syndromes and things like that. And there are photographs of that. This is an ancient history. You can see it. You don't just have to take somebody's word that, oh shit, an atomic bomb was terrible. So I wanted to make sure that if I was going to cover it, I covered it. And I was concerned that it might be too much for people, but at a certain point, you got to kind of just tell the truth with it. And on 9/11, we did have an overwhelming amount of unity as far as what most people might have experienced or likely are experiencing now in their lives, but it would be absolutely foolish to not bring up the reality of we are afraid of things that look different than us in this country, which is pretty much how to sum up when I said the pendulum of American hate. That's pretty much how it works. It's what looks different than the people that founded us. It scares us. We freak out. It's why we were able to vilify the Japanese more than the Germans during the Second World War. People from the Middle East traditionally look very different than people from Europe. So, if you look, and this is something that Avery Lentz from Battles and Banter got into very, very deeply, is we even before 9/11 slowly been kind of groomed to look at our next different looking adversary, right? The Russians even were hard with they they were easy to make our adversary because it was like communism and the atomic age and all these things. But like, they're primarily white looking people. So like, if you look in the mid 1980s with the Cold War, movies like Top Gun start to show us the proxies. They start to show us the Middle Eastern adversaries.
Right.
It's a really, really shitty movie with Charlie Sheen getting his second reference on our show here, but Navy SEALs. They're fighting a terror group named Al-Shuhada, right? You know, we're already starting to get into this.
Mid 90s with True Lies.
Absolutely.
With, Crimson Jihad was the name of the group, and it was a Middle Eastern quote unquote terrorist group as well.
Absolutely. So, but then it was validated. You know, it went from pop culture scary to like, oh my God, they actually did attack us. And I'm saying they with air quotes. Like, I don't like speaking theys, thems, them versus us, but like that's where the fear goes.
Right.
And that's what happened is we all kind of rallied around the flag and we were like, except for unless you don't look like you were born under this flag. And then it suddenly became vitriolic at best, and physically it manifested in awful ways that, you know, you might be familiar with now over the last few years with the way we've had incidents with hate on beaches, confrontations in supermarkets, you know, over the color of your skin, things like that. But like,
or several mass shootings, even just last year with the Chinese Americans or folks of Asian descent being gunned down.
Well, right. With the pandemic, right, everybody's convinced another, you know, basically all of these crazies create these conspiracy theories and we go off the deep end and we got to fix things. That's what Matt and I are doing on the History of Things podcast. We're fixing things. But no, I mean, we have an influx of Asian hate in this country because that's where uneducated jackasses, people's perception of where the COVID-19 virus came from. It came from, you know, some factory in China or whatever. And so like now, if you are Asian in this country, suddenly you are not safe because there are people out there that are angry at you for no reason.
Right.
And this happened after 9/11. You know, you were, you know, a person of
color.
Right. And it was interesting. Avery kind of pointed it out in the sense that, like, you know, usually we're focusing on, as a nation that's filled with hate, usually we're focusing on how much they hate black people in this nation. And for a couple of weeks and months, they kind of turned their attention off that. And he pointed out that it was very hyper-focused on people from the Middle East.
So the show 24, when that first season premiered, it was still 2001. The bad guys were Serbs.
Yeah.
You know, they were like Southeastern European, which was the bad guy of society for most of the 90s and 80s from the Cold War.
Right.
But you look at that show, my God, the next 8 seasons, of those 8 seasons, 4 of them are all Islamic radical terrorists.
Well, and they got in trouble for that too, as I recall.
Yeah. This concept of like, yeah, like brown is bad or like non-white is bad. And like, yes, Germans were evil, but you know, we've made amends and even with freaking Soviet Union, like you could say the whole 2000s decade was defined by it.
I remember those signs local to where I live. There's a gas station that every little stoner where I grew up knows because it was the spot to get your blunt wraps. But like those and the 2 guys that worked there when I was a little shithead stoner are still working there now. And I bet you they were working there long before I ever showed up. And they are the nicest dudes ever.
I bet you they remember you too.
Absolutely they do. Like even now, like dude, 20 years later, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just going to honestly say that. I don't know. But they do. They remember me. But they were great guys. And I remember they had the sign up. You know, they belonged to a Sikh temple down the street from where the gas station is. And they put up that they were members of the Sikh temple and they were not Muslim. And that killed me. You know, it absolutely killed me. And that's something that I'm glad you brought up, Matt, because I think a lot of people this year are going to not bring that up. I think a lot of people are going to focus on the 9/12, you know, the unity and the USA. And I think that our job as historians, like I was uncomfortable with, you know, do I or do I not show the graphic aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing? I think it's our job to kind of make you uncomfortable for a minute here and just remind you that, you know, while you're watching a multitude of documentaries like a lot of us do or news coverages or commemoration specials, and some of them will do a good job and they'll touch on this, but a lot of them will not. Just It's our job to remind you that, while we were rallying together, we were also pulling ourselves apart. And a large part of the world we're living in today is a continuation of all that. And that's not what Matt and I are here for right now, but that's just a fact. And a couple of the guys we talked to in this program get into that. One of the ones I was fascinated to talk to was Eric. So Eric Money, the producer from Addressing Gettysburg, is a veteran of the United States Army. He served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And he was pretty sobering to talk to because, when we study history, we see a lot of moments where, these moments, not to use the word twice, occur, and they are rally moments. Like after the Maine explodes in the late 1890s, right? Remember the Maine. People are enlisting, like we're going to war. Oh, we just got attacked by the Japanese in 1941. Hello. I know we have drafts and things going on, but people are enlisting to go do their parts. That didn't happen. It happened in some pockets of the country here. We had enlistments went up, but that didn't really happen. And in my mind, that did happen. But when sitting down talking to Eric, he made it pretty clear that a lot of people have this perception of how the military operates. And then there's actually how the military operates. There weren't these massive lines out down the street, to enlist, to avenge, remember the trade towers, remember the Pentagon, remember Shanksville. Not to say that didn't happen on any level, but the way you're likely imagining it, it didn't. Thousands of people at once, the exodus to the enlistment depots, those things didn't happen. And we, the people, every year on 9/11, we on some level find ourselves, hashtag never forgetting, whether it's a tweet or some jackass politician who forgets every time legislation that could help first responders comes up, does nothing about it.
Preach.
F***ing dickheads. But we find ourselves, using this as a rallying cry, either to pump ourselves up, to remind us, to feel like we're behind something that's worthwhile, remember, support our troops. Never forget. We're out there chasing the bad guys. And that's us. That's here. That's here in the United States of America. But for our troops overseas, the terror attacks on 9/11 almost became a complete afterthought to the actual military mission at hand once they were over there in the battle zones and the things they were doing. It wasn't like they were closing every meeting with hey guys, remember why we're here. They attacked our buildings. They killed thousands of us. It wasn't the same experience for them as it was for us. And at first I was kind of blown away by that because I was like, wow, the only reason you're there is because they flew those planes into the buildings and crashed in the field and things like that. And then I felt like an idiot because I'm a First World War historian, and Franz Ferdinand's death by the July crisis is basically irrelevant at that point. We're just arguing about different things, and especially on August 4th when Belgian neutrality is violated, this has nothing to do with Franz Ferdinand anymore. So I realized quickly, I was like, why would that not be a commonplace in military actions all over history? And sure enough, our good buddy Eric went through some of the worst moments that humanity has to offer you because of that terrible day in September. But it was almost not ever a part of the service itself once he was involved in it. Every year we're over here, yellow ribbons, support the troops, never forget. And they're over there just doing their jobs. And they're not, even in the 10 years since we got bin Laden, which, again, another rabbit hole conversation for a different day. We got the guy. What the hell are we still doing there? It was just interesting talking to Eric. So we'll play a couple minutes of Eric, because Eric actually had a lot to say on this. But the enlistment thing was interesting to me. So let's take a listen to Eric. How much of any of this is on your mind in 03 when you're enlisting, going through basic?
Almost none of it.
And now you're in Iraq.
Yeah, almost none of it. Once you get to that point, you don't really care about that stuff so much anymore. Right. I tell people all the time, I went to Iraq the first time out of patriotism. I went the second, third, and went to Afghanistan for the fourth deployment. purely out of a desire to help the people that I knew, basically.
Yeah.
You know, keep my friends from getting killed.
Sure.
That was kind of it.
Obviously, as you said very clearly, like none of this is on your mind. None of the towers, the Pentagon, Flight 93.
No.
This is just a war, and you're there with the guys to your left and to your right.
You have more immediate and pressing issues than to wax philosophical about something that happened, several years before at this point, and you can't do anything about anyways.
Is this something that leadership is still using as like a motivator?
I don't think so, no. I can't recall, especially towards the end, and I left the regular Army in 2015.
It'd be pretty disingenuous if they were.
Yeah, we really didn't talk about it so much. I mean, at that point, we were getting new privates who were like 3 years old when the Twin Towers were attacked, right? They didn't really have any conceptualization of a world where we weren't fighting somebody on the other side of the globe.
Eric was absolutely a pleasure to sit down with to discuss this stuff. I was very humbled to not only, sit in a room with a guy who is my friend, but like sometimes feels like a rock star because he has been in these awful and dangerous places that I've ever been through. And if you know him, he's one of the sweetest, nicest guys you'll ever meet. And
very humble about his service.
We are going to, and we're going to betray his grumpy, curmudgeon-y Addressing Gettysburg producer persona. Like he's a genuinely nice and thoughtful guy. And part of me wonders if that's just to cope with having to have lived through some of the awful things he did. But he definitely provided some good context for me as far as like, on 9/11, I won't really change my reverence, but I definitely will be more aware of how when I say things like never forget or, supporting your troops, like what that meant in reality for those guys at the time. So it was interesting also, I'm not going to play all of Eric's clip about just sort of his thoughts on how we get to where we are in 2021. But it was interesting that, Matt, Avery, and Eric all took very different roads to end up in a very similar place. That
right.
Sort of the world we're living in today is a direct result of the Tuesday in September 2001. And, we kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the recording here where like, we have a world that exists on September 10th where you can get on airplanes with, just your driver's license and your ticket. And you don't need passports or anything. You can go to Canada with just your driver's license. Like I remember my mother took us to Niagara Falls and literally she just showed them her driver's license and they were like, "What are you doing?" A, for all of our Canuck friends out there. No, they didn't say A, but they were like, what are you going to Canada for? My mom's like, just taking my kids to the falls. And they were like, cool. If you come back, show us what you bought, because customs and all. And my mom, I think the joke in our family was my mom forgot to declare 2 Beanie Babies. So like my mom smuggled in Beanie Babies in the 90s when Beanie Babies were a thing. So, that's a really badass thing to do, I guess. But I we lived in this world where like, traveling across an international border was that easy. Now you want to fly anywhere, even if it's an hour to New York, you got to get in line at TSA, 2 hours, 2.5 hours early. You got to check in, go through like 1 or 2 securities. Depending on the airport you're in, a totally invasive and violating scanner
experience.
You got to go through all of these things, random security screenings where they're pulling you out of line. It's a pretty interesting world we live in as far as transportation security. And Transportation Security Administration is under the umbrella of the Department of Homeland Security. And
which came out of the 9/11 attacks.
That is an entire part of the government that, what am I looking for? What am I trying to say? It's not a branch of the government. It's a department. Yeah. It's an entire department of our government that was a direct result of 9/11, because one of the things we realized in the intelligence work that was done afterwards was that we were a mess. We knew some things ahead of time. We could kind of have predicted some things and not others. The FBI knew this. The CIA knew that. We weren't talking to each other.
That. Nobody was talking. Exactly.
So boom, basically the president and all the politicians agree, like, hey, we need to have one place for all this information to go, and then boom, Homeland Security it is. And then honestly, 20 years later, we're back to just everybody's in their own, holding their own cards again.
Yeah, in their own playpen. One of the aspects that I remember coming out of the attacks quite vividly is the political fallout. Not only did we have the sudden realizations, especially after the 9/11 report came out, a year later, we had the sudden realizations that nobody that should be talking to one another is talking to one another. But then we had the more insidious political aspects, to be perfectly honest. And I will use a harsher word. It is insidious when we start having politicians and talking heads suggesting that we need to modify our views on American history.
Yeah.
We need to start putting out a more pro-American vibe.
Yeah.
And this sort of thing, things that we're even seeing 20 years later.
Yeah.
These conversations are still going on, and I remember being appalled at this. I was at Michigan State at the time, vice president of the undergraduate history club. That's again, nerd cred right there. The History Association of Michigan State is what we refer to.
I don't think you
as.
need to validate your nerddom to anybody anymore.
Yeah,
I think like by episode 6, people were like, "Jesus Christ, man!"
That's probably true.
Put your D&D away.
But History Association of Michigan State, or the HAMS, we were known as. We had a meeting with the faculty for the history department because we started getting these concepts coming out, and the Patriot Act. We think of the Patriot Act and some of the positive things that may have come out of the Patriot Act today, but there was some very insidious aspects of the Patriot Act that derived directly from 9/11 and this whole idea of popular history and the mythology of America and ignoring certain anti-American or what was seen as anti-American. We must realize that to study history and to put forward what actually occurred is not anti-American. It is being American. If we are willing to look at the whole face of America with all of its warts, with all of its beauty, and acknowledge that and move forward, that is being American, that is being patriotic. This idea of doing away with or covering over, or for lack of a better term, whitewashing aspects of history, American history, world history, that is not a good thing. And there were elements of the Patriot Act that were directly proposing that. And I remember being up in arms with the history department and the professors about that. There was a lot of discussion in class, but also after, during meetings and things of that nature. And fortunately, most of that did not come to pass. But we're still seeing that crap come up even to this day. And not to get into modern politics too much, but this is all derived from the 9/11 attacks and the knee-jerk reactions that caused.
No, I will say this, because I agree with Matt. I don't want to get into the politics of things too much, but Matt and I are historians. Again, like I say, me on the amateur level, Matt on the professional level. But like our job as historians is to be
truthful.
So yes, truthful. And I was going to be even nerdier for all my baseball Yankee fans out there. So Bob Shepard, rest in peace, the voice of God, the public address announcer for the Yankee Stadium for a very long time, basically lived his life and his job by this rule of the 3 C's. You need to be clear, concise, and correct.
Right.
And that's what our job is.
Yeah, let me reiterate, not truthful, factual.
Factual.
Truth, it's
truth is subjective.
eye of the beholder. It's very subjective.
I mean, your truth and my truth are different.
Are different, exactly.
Like, you think the Red Wings are a good hockey team, and I think you're dumb.
Well, they're a great hockey team.
Go
You're
Rangers.
Right.
But you're 100% correct. Our job is to be factual. And whether that makes you uncomfortable or not, as we were discussing with how I'm trying to navigate my way through my coverage of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like I was struggling with, do I or do I not show people some of these graphic images of what the effects were? Ultimately, I decided to do it. Matt and I discussed it, and it's the right thing to do. It's hard for you to see. I understand that. We're human. It's hard to see our fellow, humans in sad ways. And unfortunately, that's part of my job. That's part of Matt's job, is to be factual. That is what happened. That is what occurred. So while I don't really want to get into, the politics like Matt's talking about, what we do need to be honest about, and I think Matt will back me up here, is Matt and I will forever die on the hill of what is right, what is factual, and whatever else is just whatever else is. Matt will be a lot more professional about it. I will probably be a lot louder about it. But it's, it is what it is. But in the aftermath of 9/11, things like the Patriot Act, while they did some good, they also did things like Matt's saying, was they sort of threatened the facts. And those are dangerous things to do. If you see, we just saw literally this year what can happen when you are operating wildly with an incorrect set of facts.
Right. Exactly.
And we were flirting with this 20 years ago. And that's one of the things that I thought was interesting when we were talking with Avery, was just how many incredibly direct connections there are between the terror attacks and some of the strife, for lack of a better word, that we've been living through for the last couple of years. The social unrest, honestly, the positive movements that our country is making through some of the death throes of the older ways of thinking. But there's a lot of just very direct, tangible connections between these two moments in time 20 years apart. And Avery did a really good job sort of giving us his perspective on the last 20 years.
It's kind of, as a historian, you get these moments where you're like, wow, I'm experiencing my own event, this world-shaping event that's still continuing to shape that. But like World War II, that's all condensed into, 5-7 years for us. And, here's a war that's 20 years old, stemmed from a single day in 2001. And it has just been this, it's just been like multiplying ever since, man. Like the repercussions, the reverberations have not stopped. There's still rippling. And
they're going to keep going.
And they're going to keep going. You asked me, does this affect, now we have, everyone thinks black people suck again or something like that. Sure. Or BLM's a bunch of looters, or dang Asians made the coronavirus. Look at all the xenophobia that we've had to go through in the last freaking 5 years almost. I mean, you can even go back to Obama becoming president, and a brown guy being president with a name like Obama.
As we were sitting here talking to Avery, just listening to him express, his feelings on how we went from a Tuesday in September to our day-to-day existence in 2021, and how many times you can take something that we're living through right now and just 6 degrees of separation it right back to that Tuesday. Yep. It was fascinating. If you want to have contemporary history conversations more regularly with your podcast, highly recommend you check out Battles and Banter. That is a place that you are going to get the facts, the truth, however you want to use the term truth and facts, but you're going to get it the way it is, and you're going to get it raw, and it's going to hurt sometimes, and there's going to be a lot of F words because Avery goes ham on his show, but you're definitely going to get it. He's a good friend of ours, and it was a pleasure sitting down with him, and it was just wild to listen to. I felt like he was sitting in my brain, like answering the questions that I just wasn't asking at the time, and it was pretty crazy. What did you think about the way that sort of Avery connected 20 years of sort of huge moments all into one?
No, I thought that was very good, and being a historian of color, he has a much different perspective on things than you and I do.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to bring in that part of the conversation, so I was very pleased that he was able to take the time and sit down with us on that, and was willing to do so, to be perfectly honest, because he is getting it from a completely different angle. The connecting the dots between 2001 and 2021 were particularly vivid.
It's very sobering.
It was. Absolutely.
Which, you know, now that we're referencing the modern world we live in and a lot of how it's connected, you know, we'll start to wrap the show up with sort of the ultimate reflection. So as we wind down this show, this part of the show was actually not, as you're listening to it now, was not recorded as part of the original production of this show. When I had the idea that I wanted to do the project like this, it was sort of like a film thing. And then when I talked to Matt here, we got really into the idea of doing this as a podcast, and we sort of morphed it into something for this show. And we had a vision, and we kind of planned it out, and we executed on the plan. And we realized that history was still unfolding. This story was still unfolding because as we were wrapping up production for this, it was August of 2021. The war is, you know, quote unquote, supposed to be over, you know, on the 31st of this month, you know, as we're recording. Actually, just to give you guys a context, as you're listening, it's September 1st. We wanted to wait until the deadline came and passed because Matt and I felt, you know, our job is to be clear, concise, and correct. It's to be factual, truthful, but truth is subjective, as we've gone over in the past. So our job is to get it right, and just to sort of, and like we would be remiss if we didn't talk about this.
And to be as complete as possible.
Absolutely. So here's what's happened since we finished recording. The Taliban, which was the enemy of the American forces, you know, that we were, you know, fighting over in Afghanistan, swept through the country as basically as America was closing down its operations, and the coalition forces, so our allies and all that stuff, were closing down their forces. They, you know, started closing bases in Kandahar, you know, Bagram Air Force Base, things like that. And essentially, we would throw the term abandoned around a lot, but like they were closed down. We didn't just like run into the darkness kind of thing. But we left, and basically as we left, the Taliban was just sweeping right in behind them. Specifically, I think with Bagram Air Force Base, they're talking 20 minutes from the time the last American boots leave, but to the time the first Taliban troops arrive. So the country fell really fast. It was really interesting and kind of difficult to watch. And so this conversation, this part of the conversation might be a little weird for Matt and I because we try not to editorialize. We like to have a lot of fun, so you'll hear some like small opinions here and there about like what we think of certain historical figures. Like if you listen to a very recent episode of ours, you know, we tell you what we think about Benedict Arnold. But like we try to keep it to that kind of stuff, you know, where it's obvious and there's some parameters to that. So what we don't do is we really don't get into modern politics, but it's almost impossible not to sort of play with fire. I mean, we are literally playing with fire just even doing this episode, you know, because this is, you know, still contemporary to our lives. So here we go, right? So the Taliban swept over the nation. It was kind of really interesting to watch, right? And I remember you were on vacation, Matt, and Kabul fell. And I called you, because I'm that guy that bothers people on vacation. And I said, dude, I think we need to have another chat on record, you know, for the show. And you were right on the same page immediately because, like, it was so surreal. So, like, you know, so I'm going to ask you this question, Matt. We had just done the entire recording of the show, right? Not only did we live through the last 20 years and we have our own experiences reflecting back since the 2001 terror attacks, you know, we just did the whole show. So we got deep into sort of timelines and facts. So we got really deep into the weeds as far as the details. So this story is really fresh in our mind. And as it's happening, it's quote unquote ending right before our eyes on national television in a kind of dramatic and borderline weirdly, sometimes it could be described as disastrous or clunky. Like, we'll leave that to you to get really into how you want to view that. But like, it didn't go super great and it was awkward to watch. And I had a lot more feelings than I thought. What was all that like for you?
Honestly, initially, Pat, I started thinking about our friends and colleagues, other men and women that I know who had served over there. And because I didn't, I shifted to, gosh, what must they be feeling?
Right.
Do they have comrades that they lost? Do they have friends in the population, the Afghanis, their interpreters, their folks over there? How are we going to do good by them and get those people out? How are our friends and colleagues and whatnot feeling about this situation, watching 20 years of blood, sweat, tears, and treasure essentially evaporate? And then how are we going to do good by the people that we're leaving behind?
Literally, everybody listening heard a voice on this show tonight that served in this theater. Like Matt, as I watched a helicopter flying around Kabul looking for Americans on rooftops, I thought about him. I thought about Eric immediately. He's probably the person closest to me that I know served over there. My brother-in-law served over there. But like Eric and I are boys. What up, Eric Money? But like, it's one of those things that like my heart was breaking. Like that's a good way I think to describe it in such a multifaceted way. My heart was breaking. So what was this like for you? Like while you're like on vacation, dude, like you're trying to enjoy, like, let's tell the people where you were.
I was actually in Hawaii.
So like paradise, right? Like, and so like now suddenly this, because you and I feel the world heavily on our shoulders. That's our job as historians, is to like write and observe and like keep these legacies. And we're like seeing this, and we had committed to this project. So like, what's it like, kind of trying to absorb all this in paradise, dude?
Well, I was trying to not be a downer for the rest of my family that was there, but I was keeping track of things on, say, Reddit and the news sites and different talking heads on YouTube and things of that nature. Just to keep abreast of the situation. And honestly, initially I fell into the same trap that a lot of people did, trying to compare the fall of Kabul with the fall of Saigon in 1975. Not really comparable.
There are a lot of visual parallels.
Exactly.
That's about it.
And that's exactly what I was about to say, Pat, because when you see that Chinook over the buildings there in Kabul and they're pulling people off, it looks a heck of a lot like the Chinook that was there in Saigon in that very famous photograph. And of course, the news media was picking up on that and everybody was chattering about it. Big difference, though, in what had happened there. But I fell into that initial reaction of, oh crap, it's the fall of Saigon.
The two things I want to be clear about that are relatable between these two endings of military conflict are, one, a couple visuals like Matt just described, and also a sense of what was this for?
Right.
By the veterans themselves. Like a lot of Vietnam veterans, even to this day, will still, and we as a society still kind of, now we all accept, like, what was this for? Our Afghan and Iraq war veterans, but we're going to focus on Afghanistan because that is the sort of the crux of this entire conversation, is like we were attacked in 2001 and we went to war in Afghanistan. The 2003 war is where the politics of this conversation comes in, and so we're not going there. But we did have friends that served over there, and so like for them, I wonder if them and Vietnam veterans have a lot more in common than they ever did. Like before,
I suspect that's the case.
They had the Band of Brothers camaraderie, but like this is a very unique experience.
Right.
So,
the United States, in its more recent conflicts, continues to do very well on the battlefield. We do very well at winning wars. We have had a much harder time winning the peace.
Yes. That is a very apt description of what this is and what we kind of do. It's also interesting, like, what is winning? In the past, militarily, most of our wars, I'd say right up until World War II, is probably the last war we engage in where the lines in the sand are very clear, or mostly clear, between, right, wrong, or bad guy, good guy, if you want to use those air quotes, things like that. World War I gets crazy because that's like a real diplomatic war of insanity, but, like the war on terror is not a war against a defined enemy. It's a war against an ideology.
Right.
And like, firstly, it's
and
just
splinters of ideologies.
Yeah. And it's just like the war on drugs. You cannot win that war. It's too general. And specifically with ideology, I want to be very specific with this. Fighting ideas, you can't kill ideas. Like, as long as people are alive, they share. And ideas spread. That's why even after, the fall of communism in Russia and the Red Scares of the Cold War era, like, communism's still in existence. mean, like, one of the United States' biggest competitors on the world stage is a communist nation.
Right.
I mean, they're a modified communist nation, but they're still a communist nation. So anyway, back on track. The idea that we tried to do the show without considering the end, looking back, personally for me, feels a little foolish. And I'm glad that we decided to have this chat, because it's one of the very few times you'll actually hear Matt and I sort of tell you a little bit more about how we feel. So one of the things I want to ask you again, Matt, is like, you know, where does this fit into the overall story for you? Because for us, this was a 20-year reflection, and we were doing it at like 19.9 years, right, of the story. So like, now that we're at the full circleness of it, the actual 20th year since the terror attacks is going to come out. It's the day after this episode comes out. So if you're listening to this, the day this episode is coming out is tomorrow. It's 20 years. It's September 11th, 2021. So where does this fit into the overall story for you? Like, now that we're really reflecting on and I'm going to use air quotes every time I say end, because again, this was a war against an ideology. We merely ended military conflict, but the enemy we perceived still exists.
And is now the de facto government.
Correct. So
where we just got out of.
So before we jump back to that real quickly, just how does this all like play into a 20-year story for you now? Like, how do you feel?
Again, for me, it's personally, for me, it's less of an impact on my life so much as it is thinking about those who served over there, thinking about those who lived through it over there, be they military or civilian, and how it's going to affect them. As a historian, of course, I'm looking at this as a 20-year block and seeing how much it has affected the world stage.
Yeah.
And those impacts, be it from the craziness that we have to go through at the airport up to very big policy changes within the United States government and likely our allies' governments as well. Not being as familiar with the structure and whatnot of those, but we had full departments that did not exist come out of this conflict. Department of Homeland Security.
Absolutely.
Huge in the U.S. government. Did not exist prior to 9/11. This war, though, the actual 20 years of conflict, is now our longest conflict in U.S. history. Up until that point, it had been another heartbreak of a war, Vietnam.
Right.
So I think your point of a moment ago, Pat, of the shared experience of United States veterans between Vietnam and the War on Terror are similar in a lot of ways. And I think, and I hope, they will be able to find some camaraderie and some way to heal, if you will, if needed by them in that camaraderie. What I keep coming back to, though, because we have at least, and say what you will about the VA, at least we have some sort of structure to attempt to help people, to attempt to help veterans. But what I keep coming back to is, what are we going to do about our allies, specifically the Afghans that helped us?
Yeah.
Because we didn't do right by the Iraqis that helped us.
No, we did not.
And again, we're not going to get into that particular aspect of this story, but we've got 125,000-ish South Vietnamese out of Vietnam in 75 with the evacuation. Are we going to be doing something like that for the Afghans? And the current administration has done a lot to move people out. It's actually, besides the initial day of the evacuation, that initial panic, the actual evacuation went fairly smoothly. We did have that terrible, terrible ISIS attack.
So let's talk about that right now, because I think I want to make a point in context of what you are talking about, but you can't make it without discussing this.
Okay.
So on my birthday this year, August 26th, right, we were recording our show with Rob Ambrose. It was his follow-up for our big Q3 show we did with him. That was the deadliest day in the American military in 10 years.
Correct.
2011, was the last time we had a significant number of American casualties on a battlefield. So here's what happened. On August 26, 2021, a suicide bomber from the terror group ISIS-K, which represents a branch of the overall ISIS ideology, right? This is a war on ideology. And as Matt said, it splinters, right? Because here's plot twist. ISIS and the Taliban do not like each other.
Not at all.
Not at all. And that's part of the quotes of the story continuing. We'll get there, blah, 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 blah. We won't get there, but it's just the world will get there. It's unfolding as we're talking. It's all these things are happening. But on August 26, 2021, a suicide bomber claimed by the terror group ISIS-K detonated himself and killed 170 civilians, I think, and 13 American service members. Injured a bunch more. A bunch of I think 10 of the 13 were Marines, things like that. So we lost Americans as we left. I have a lot of thoughts on this. But the point I wanted to make was when you said that this administration has done a fairly good job with this since the initial panic of the evacuation, and actually then got very organized and executed very well. I think in 20 years, I wonder, for those of you listening out there who are objective, I wonder how we'll look back on this in 20 and 50 and 75 years, because in reality, one of the most efficient airlifts in world history was just conducted. Fact. And it was conducted with only, and mind you, while surrounded by enemies. Like the U.S. military operation at this point has shrunk itself down to literally Hamid Karzai International Airport. And they're literally operating in just a single airport and they only have half of it. Like the Afghan civilian population is trying to run the other half of that. But on all sides, our Taliban fighters, our ISIS-K, and you can't tell who's who in certain situations, right? So we are conducting, I say we because I'm an American, but one of the most efficient airlifts in military history, in world history. It's right up there with the evacuation in Vietnam. It's right up there with the Indian evacuation of Kuwait and the Gulf War that almost nobody in this country knows about. I think that's actually the largest airlift in world history, technically. But only 13 men and women died in this. And I think not to say that in like a only sense, but like when you consider what took place in a war zone, surrounded by enemies.
Right. Of our servicemen and women.
Yeah. Yes. So that's the other reason that this episode's been interesting to talk through, is because like you might accidentally trip and say something disrespectful and like not even intend to. So like I want to be very clear. I didn't mean to exclude anybody. It's just the point I'm trying to make is just when you consider the overall scope of what was required to meet the August 31st deadline, which again, that is a very politically charged point in and of itself, but it's goddamn heroic, miraculous, and kind of still unbelievable. I was dreading the day I saw the breaking news. Like you and I said it. Like we just kind of like this was coming. We knew it, and like the closer we got, because at that point we were only 5 days away. I was like, the first time I allowed the thought to creep in, like maybe this is gonna go off. Like maybe, and when it didn't, it was like, ah. But then like I immediately thought, like, not immediately, but like as we decided to do this chat, and a couple days later, I thought, I wonder how history will write this story, because the fact is that it was one of the biggest operations in history. It was operated efficiently. Unfortunately, men and women died. That happens in war. It's a really shitty reality. And so we'll just leave that at that. But for me personally, this whole experience has left me very confused. I have a lot of feelings on this. I have a lot of friends that served over there. I typically feel a certain way about all these conflicts, and I find myself feeling semi-contrary to my, decade-held beliefs at this point and stuff like that. I'm confused. I'm kind of angry. I'm bewildered, astonished. There's like an endless number of ways to describe how I feel. I think confused is probably the best because I don't know what it's like to be a veteran.
Right.
I don't know what it's like to feel hopelessness because that's what I perceive a lot of my veteran friends to feel right now. A lot of just lost, like a lot of people that are walking around with a lot of horrors on their soul. For what? And like I ask that question rhetorically, and I ask it knowing that it's charged.
Certainly.
But that's honestly how I feel. And I'll say it to you like this. The reason I say I feel that way now is because it was really clear to me for at least the first 10 years of the conflict while we were there. We were there to shut down terror operations, and in the process, we were going to find bin Laden, and we were going to fucking kill him.
Right.
Right? Like, that was made super clear. And we did that. I mean, the first operation went off almost within, like, weeks and months. Like, the Taliban was, like, super wiped out of the... That's the damning part. They came flooding back into the nation as quickly as they were wiped out. And it made sense that they were wiped out that fast, right? Because we were flexing American military muscle. And war is our best import.
Yeah.
Regardless of what economic thing you're about to bring up, apples, I don't care, whatever, cars, war is America's chief export. And we are f***ing good at it.
Very.
And so here we are in Afghanistan in 2001, wiping out the enemy. Boom. But in 2021, they came back just as fast. But like in 2011, we got the guy. So in 2001, in 2002, we swept out the Taliban. Boom. Objective 1 completed. We shut down the hub of a big terror operation, Al-Qaeda, supported by the Taliban, right? And then 10 years later, we got the guy, you know, and we actually didn't even really touch on that in the reflection too much. So I'll allow that in a minute here. But like, because that's also, now I'm extra confused because of this. In fact, let's just get into it right now. So in 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by Navy SEAL Special Force teams, right? And in that moment, I allowed myself to feel some American exceptionalism. I was like, yes, USA. Like, I was pumped. And it was weird because I also felt weirdly sad in that moment because I think, you know, in that taking the higher road mentality, like, I don't think we should be celebrating in a man's death because that's kind of the thing we watch on the news when things happen over here is we watch people celebrate in the streets over there, you know, and they burn our flags and they do all that stuff. And I thought, well, maybe I just won't, maybe I won't gloat. Maybe I'll be like, well, you, but maybe you're at peace now and we can be past this. But in reality, I can't. Like, I'm not over it. And I didn't feel the compassion I tried to feel. But I allowed myself to be pumped up in 2011. And you would think, right? All right, we got out the terrorists and then we got the guy, war over, right? 10 years later, Matt, we're finishing this story right now.
Right.
And now I'm hella confused because you can explain 10 years of warfare to me. Maybe even a couple years after that. But 20 years of warfare in a place where empires go to die.
I'm glad you touched on that point because we're pushing 200 years of conflict at this point in Afghanistan. If we go back to, say, the first Anglo-Afghan War in the 1840s, I think it was the end of 40s, this is the graveyard of empires. That's why it has that name.
Yes.
The English, the Russians, us. It is not a conquerable place in the traditional sense. And it's very easy for us to be sitting in the War Department studio here and make these projections, but there is a lot of historical context to back that up.
For sure.
The issue that I think you're having, and what I think a lot of us are having in regards to the death of bin Laden and then the continuation of the war for another 10 years, has a lot to do with mission creep. And the United States military suffered badly in these conflicts, both of them, from mission creep. And this is not a shot at the military by any stretch of the means because our men and women and our allies went hella above and beyond.
Absolutely.
During both of these conflicts, during all of the mission creep, during all the little weird-ass wars that got stuck in there, too, between ISIS, between the continuing civil war in Syria, between the crap that went down in Libya. I mean, we've got all these other little conflicts that are screwing around too.
Fighting Boko Haram in Africa.
Sure.
So real
exactly.
quick, before you continue, just want to be clear. You can support the troops, but not the war they're involved in, right? They are following orders, right? People join the military for a bunch of different reasons, right? Not everybody signs up for patriotic God and country. So some people are there because they need to be or want to, whatever. But like they're there at the discretion of officers and politicians. So if you really don't like why they're there, talk to the people that are putting them there, but support them because they're in the middle of this right? So anyway, just to continue.
Von Clausewitz once famously wrote, I should say, that war is an extension of policy, or of politics.
Yes.
And he wrote it in far more eloquent terms than I can say.
Sure.
But he's not wrong. And unfortunately, our men and women, fighting men and women, and our allies suffered because of that, because of this constant mission creep. Okay, we hit these markers, but now we've got some more.
Yep.
Or we've been here so long, we've done this, but now don't you really think we should do this? There's a lot of reasons why this happened. Some of them good, some of them bad, I'm sure of that. But we were putting young men and women who were there to do a very specific military job, and suddenly they're trying to rebuild infrastructure. Suddenly they're trying to be negotiators, or at least trying to make some sort of negotiations happen between warring tribes and factions and groups that had hated each other for hundreds of years or more.
The war on terror became a nation-building war.
Right, exactly. In both cases, for the two major conflicts. But these are oftentimes, and it's the troops on the ground that are doing this. Yes, we have officers who have been in the military for their entire careers, and fantastic for that. We've got generals and things that are over there, and they're trying to do higher level things with our allies, generals and whatnot. But we've got men and women on the ground who are trying to negotiate with tribal elders and warlords and faction leaders, and they're in their 20s.
Kids.
Sometimes late teens. What the hell?
Kids.
They never should have been put in that situation, and I apologize for going dramatic, but they never should have been put in that situation. This is the mission creep that screwed the situation over. America wins wars. We don't win peace very well. I will reiterate that fact.
You could almost argue that the war was won in 2001 or 2. I mean, we went there and accomplished the military objective of sweeping out the terrorist cell and the government, quote unquote, that was harboring them.
Absolutely.
I mean, we accomplished that.
And we rolled Iraq in what?
Months.
Months? Yeah. Weeks?
Yeah, weeks. Weeks is probably, I mean, I'm not an Iraq war expert on either war, so don't come at me heavy if we're wrong on that, but it was very fast. So that's where I'm at, is like, I guess the peace struggle, because and again, I say you could explain 10 years because bin Laden exists, even after the Taliban falls and Al-Qaeda is kind of effectively wiped out for the time being. Again, ideology is sort of what the theme here is. Like again, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, so I guess I wanted to just make sure that in this episode that we were honest with how we are feeling at the end of it, because for a while there's this like terrible nostalgia while you're listening to this, because like you remember what it was like. I'm guaranteeing a lot of you, this was hard for me to produce, so I'll level with you, right? Like I've done the majority of the production work on this show. It started as an idea for the solo brand, right? So
Absolutely.
like, I've been doing a lot more of the behind the scenes work than I usually do. And this has been really hard because I've been listening sometimes for things you won't even hear on the show. Like I won't even include, but like just for context, I'll listen to Survivor interviews or people that, are next of kin, or, I listen to the president's speech or both of them, just a lot of things, news coverage. So like this episode was hard for me at a couple points to listen to in editing. And I imagine, and I'm sorry if it is, I imagine it's going to be hard for some of you out there listening. And that's okay. This is still hard. I mean, that's sort of why we did this, because I think it's important not to rub the wound while it's red, but it's important to
reflect.
Look down and see it and understand that, we are 20 years removed. And I will say some positives and some truths here, some facts. The war is quote unquote over, but our guys and gals are out of there.
That's a plus.
That is a huge plus, because at this point, at least we're not throwing American lives away. And you can take my words and Matt, that might not be how Matt feels, y'all. That's kind of how I feel. I feel like we might have been wasting American lives towards the ends of this. So I just want to be clear. If you don't feel the same way as I do, Matt, don't come at heavy on Matt if you don't agree with me right there.
There were times during this 20-year period where the flag never seemed to get above half-mast.
Yeah.
Weeks, months.
Pretty tired of that.
On end and on end and on end. And we're out of there now. We're out of both now. Yeah. Or I think with Iraq, we're still kind of in a wrap-up stage. But regardless, we're getting out of there. And that is a good thing. It is a good thing. That is a good thing.
It was interesting to see, in a sobering way for me. Did you see the picture of the Major General, the last American boot to step on the plane? Did you see that picture? I'm going to show you this picture right now. It was surreal for me to see this, because I screenshotted it because I never wanted to lose this image. This is a Major General in the U.S. Army in full battle dress, Kevlar, holding his rifle. I don't think I've ever seen a Major General in a actual combat situation anywhere I've really studied, other than a few desperate places in First World War settings or Civil War settings. The general officers don't usually get hurt, which is why it's a big deal when it happens. They're usually in the rear, which is why they make those, enlisted rank assumptions about the brass in the back and things like that. But first of all, I admire leadership, sort of the Hal Moore philosophy of, if you're familiar with the We Were Soldiers Once and Young story and stuff like that, but be the first on the ground and the last off. This guy was probably not the first on the ground, right? Because 20 years ago, he was probably a young guy like us. But it was interesting to see this guy was ready to fight. The last guy stepping off was ready to fight. He wasn't stepping off in a business uniform, the formal stuff.
The Class A's or something.
Yeah, I mean, he was stepping off ready to get shot at and return fire. And I was like, holy shit. I'm glad this is over. Nobody that I know and care about that's still serving is going to be deployed to Afghanistan anymore. And I was so very personally, my brother-in-law is still in the National Guard. And when they, before I got the understanding of where the 6,000 additional troops were going to come from, I got really nervous that troops with, combat experience were going to get called up. Because I get the impression that they weren't just calling up random units. I get the impression if they were calling up units, it was going to be guys that had already done this once before, which makes sense because they pulled a lot of units from in theater. I think all 6,000 of the troops that reinforced Hamid Karzai were from the Iraq region, because again, we do still have a large presence there, larger than you might realize. So 20 years, minus a week or so, has truly come and gone now.
Yeah.
On a Tuesday in 2001, when we were kids, we were attacked. We watched major symbols of American freedom, all the things that we want to believe are good about our nation, right? All the things that those are supposed to represent, right? The flag is an ideology in and of itself, right?
Certainly.
Our own flag draws a lot of emotion to it. And, for me, it's two things. It is a piece of cloth, but it is also a piece of cloth that represents the ideology that I really, really like and really love, and I aspire to be as an American. I think they intentionally wrote pursuit of happiness in the Declaration because there's nothing that says we get to be happy. It's just we always get to pursue it.
Right.
But I do believe that. I think that's, whether we're going through the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Jim Crow, of the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century era America, or our current time right now, or whatever times we're going to have in the future, I think the flag to me represents that we're endeavoring towards these,
striving towards something better.
Other people means other things, but I think that when I think about, the towers being attacked, and I think about the Pentagon being attacked, I think about the things the flag aspires to be. So I feel the weight of the symbolism of the attack. And then when I think about Flight 93, especially in the 20 years of retrospect, the more I've learned about it, and honestly, I had a single conversation with Rich Condon, right after meeting him, that really influenced my perspective on Flight 93. And so the inspirational hopelessness that is Flight 93, it moves me that they got to fight.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, and I don't think we will ever know, if people got to fight in any of the other situations. But they definitely got to fight on Flight 93.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it was tragic. But that, when I think about all this, when I'm 15 and it's happening, I'm scared and I'm freaked out and I'm lost and I'm confused. And as I grew into a man that ended up having a family, I started to learn more about the overall picture of what it was, and my feelings started to drastically change, but some things didn't. So for me, 20 years later, here's where I'm at. Everybody. How do I say this? Every September, I feel like a weird part of me dies. And I'm not sure why that is. But I feel that way. And it's always when I think about 9/11. I think about the terror attacks on the towers, the Pentagon, and Flight 93. And I think that as I have grown to learn more about the politics, the ideologies, the warfare, and all that stuff, the feelings in relation to those have changed, and they're mine personally. And if you listen to our show for real, you've probably figured out how I feel about some things here and there. All the crumbs are out there, guys, but my feelings are my own. Matt's feelings are his own. But I'm still sad every September. And I'm going to be really sad this September. I am really sad right now as we're talking, because I'm thinking wow, in 20 years, what kind of life have I lived? And that's the point.
Right.
I got to live my life.
Exactly.
Over the last 20 years. And there's almost 3,000 people in a single day that didn't. What about all the men and women that went over and served in these wars that no longer get to? And so I think about that. So the lives I've lived, I say that because I've been a musician, I've been a student, I've been a historian, I've been a construction contractor, I've been a water purifier, I've been a whole bunch of random shit. I've been an absolute up in my life. I have been borderline destitute financially.
But you've been allowed to be those things.
Right. And I was allowed to get it together.
Right.
And I do, and I'm fortunate. And I'm literally living a life today that I never thought I'd have. I'm married, I own a house, got a great career. Stresses me out, but I got a great career, wonderful children. I'm living in heaven. And I feel at times when I think, specifically when I'm focused on this subject, I feel this weird guilt.
No, that's absolutely. Absolutely.
And I'll connect it before I hand it over to you to sort of give your final wrap up thoughts on this. I think a couple things. One, I'm still confused. I have a lot of anger right now in the real time as we're recording in 2021, because and again, personal politics, feelings, things like that. So I won't say them on the air because I don't really just want you to hate my show because I don't believe something you believe, right? I want you to listen to my show so that you learn something from it, right? So, but that's part of the honesty of this. I'm frustrated. Frustrated is a good, honest, and diplomatic way of describing this at the end. I'm frustrated at the end, not at the person at the end. I'm frustrated at the process. I'm frustrated at some of the moves that the administration did. I'm frustrated at the inevitable that we knew. Ripping a Band-Aid off sucks. It doesn't mean it, knowing it's going to hurt doesn't make it not hurt.
Right.
And that's kind of where we're at. And to tie it all back in, we are American Civil War nerds. We are Maryland Campaign 1862 nerds.
Oh, yeah.
And usually you and I are good boys, and when we are up in that part of the woods, we make a point to visit the last veteran to be interred in the cemetery there, who is probably our closest connection to the initial beginnings of the War on Terror.
He's 6 months older than I am.
That's right. So Patrick Howard Roy died in the 2000 USS Cole attack in Yemen. I think it was in Yemen.
Yep.
Which Osama bin Laden was the perpetrator of. So it was the second time he popped up on our radar in as many as 2 years, because I think he was behind the embassy bombings in '98 as well. And when
Marine barracks bombing too, I think.
Correct. And I think about Patrick a lot right now because he was only a little bit older than you. And I've thought about him in relation to 9/11 a lot. So 20 years later, I'm wondering what kind of life he would have lived.
Yeah.
And I'm confused, and I'm sad, and I'm angry. I've never met this guy or a single member of his family. But I'm a patron of Antietam National Battlefield as often as I can be. Volunteer there. I have family that spilled their blood there in 1862. I have family that's buried in that same cemetery with the Sailor Roy. But I wonder what kind of life he would. And I think there's a lot of people wondering that same thought about thousands of people, veterans, people that died in the attacks, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, sons and daughters, everything.
Yeah, loved ones across the board.
So I think it's okay, and I'll say this to wrap it all up for me. I think it's okay to be the way you are feeling, however it is. I think it is okay to feel different things. And I encourage you to be safe, to talk about how you feel, and just to hug somebody. Because right now, somebody is thinking that 20 years ago was the last time they hugged somebody, or was thinking that because of what happened 20 years ago, it led to something that became the last time they hugged somebody. Somebody stepped off on an airplane to go serve in a combat zone and never came back. Or the next time they came back, it was at Delaware. It was at Dover Air Force Base. And they came back in a box draped with a flap. So I love you all. Thank you for listening to the History Things podcast. Matt, take us home, buddy.
Well, Pat, to be perfectly honest, I basically want to piggyback off you because I absolutely understand that frustration that you're feeling, the sense of not necessarily personal loss, but confusion by the situation. We are often raised on this idea of American exceptionalism, which you and I both know is not accurate. We're both very proud of our country. I consider both of us patriots.
Absolutely.
It's okay to question things that your country does. It's okay to be able to point to mistakes and say, this was a mistake, and learn from it. This was a mistake, and we will have to learn from it. Whether or not we're talking about when and how we go into a place, how we leave a place, how we conduct ourselves in that place. This series of conflicts, because again, it's more than just Afghanistan, it's more than just Iraq. This series of conflicts in 2 decades has reshaped the way we look at warfare, reshaped the way we look at how we engage in said warfare, and in many ways, just as, if not more importantly, how we engage with the world. What we need to do now is, what we need to keep in mind now is that we have thousands upon thousands of veterans, men and women, all branches of the service, who have served, are serving, who might need a little time, who might need to talk. And a lot of them won't want to, and that's typical. And that's okay. Let's do everything we can now to help them find a new direction in life. Be that if they're staying in the military, fantastic. If they are getting out, let's Help them with that transition. Let's help them with issues that they may be having coming out of this conflict. And just as importantly, we need to be thinking about our responsibility as a country to the people who aided us in those conflicts. The translators, the folks over there that we're now proposing to bring over here. These are our allies. These are people who put everything on the line for us, for the dream that they had of not being under the heel of a dictator or the heel of a regime. The refugees, because that's what they are now, that we're bringing in, need to be treated as such.
Yep.
We need to support those folks, help them get settled, and try to show them the ideal of America. They've seen America's military and how good it is at kicking ass, for lack of a better term, in some cases for 20 years. Let's show them the rest of what America is.
Yeah.
And what it can be. And there are folks out there who are concerned about refugees and things of that nature. These are our allies. These are people who, like I said, put everything on the line for us, to, in many cases, to help protect our servicemen and women. The least we can do is help them. So as we wrap it up here tonight, I just want to thank everybody for listening. This was a very powerful show. Again, Pat had originally planned this for a solo work, and I was quite honored to be brought in on it. I don't talk about 9/11 very much. I have, and as we expressed on the show this evening, a lot of differing and clashing thoughts about it, and about the 20 years since. So it has been cathartic to talk on it. It's been good to hear our friends and colleagues and family members speak on it as well. And it's been difficult. It's been difficult conversations. But it is a series of conversations that we will continue to have, not only amongst our own circle, but we encourage you out there to have as well. So thank you very much for joining us tonight on the History Things podcast. Pat, take us home.
All right. So I think Matt just you just said that beautifully, dude. There's a new mission, right? When we were attacked on September 11th, 2001. Never forget. Okay. We will never forget. It's one of the worst days in our nation's history. Our American servicemen and women and our allies went to war. So we never forget what they did. We never forget why they did it. And as Matt is saying, we never forget who helped us do it. A lot of us have grandparents and great-grandparents or parents who are immigrants, who themselves are immigrants. But I'm going to focus on one specific vision for you. A lot of us have grandparents and great-grandparents who came through Ellis Island and places like that during Depression eras all around the world. They were refugees of economic crisis. They were refugees of political crisis, of religious, ideological war, all these things. And they came here because we have a statue that tells the world to give us, you're tired, you're sick, you're weary, and all that. In the future, somebody's grandparent will have stepped off of a C-17, airlifted out of Afghanistan, and their grandkids will be Americans. And they'll love their grandparents just like we do. And they'll talk about them the same way we do. And they'll have the same experience. And that's something that I think we need to keep in context, is that we're watching, in a weird way, a time capsule of something a lot of us have lived through generationally already. We're watching the beginnings of a new flood of refugees. They are coming here in search of the freedom that they hear about.
Right.
So we, the people, need to act. Our new mission is to take care of the men and women who fought over there, to take care of our friends who fought over there with them, whether that's the men and women of other nations who wore other flags in battle, or that's the Afghans themselves who are leaving everything that they know and handing their children to Marines on parapets. You know, like these people, we need to act accordingly. So 20 years later, I wish everybody good luck. The world is scary. It's been scary every day. It's probably the thing I learned most as an adult. It's terrifying. As soon as I decided to have children, I suddenly became afraid of the world. And I understand that now. I was somebody's kid on 9/11. And now I hope every day of my life that my kids never have to have a day like that. Or any of the other, and again, because we're not a political show, one thing we didn't get into is in the 20 years that has happened since then, we've had more school shootings than you can think about. We've lost a space shuttle. We had an oil disaster. We had so many things.
Multiple oil disasters.
We had so many things that were stop and remember where you were moments. And I hope now that I have children that I don't have to live through this anymore. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase it. I hope that they don't have to live through this. So good luck, everybody. Right? We go into the future, and I hope that it's up to us to shape how that goes. So that's probably my final reflection on all this. Is the baton is now handed to us. Those of us who were kids when this happened have now grown up in this world. This is our world. And everything about it was changed because of a terror attack on a Tuesday in 2001. The way we fly, the way we drive across international borders to our friends north and south of here, the way we conduct military operations. So, thank you for listening to our show. October 1st is coming up pretty soon. So back to your regularly scheduled programming at that point. But I needed to do this, and I appreciate you all hanging out with me while we did this. And yeah, you guys are the best. Thanks for listening to the History Things podcast. Good night.